The night was dark and still, the only sounds coming from the gently lapping water of the river against the riverbank. Suddenly, out of the shadows, a group of men emerged, their faces obscured in the darkness. They were armed with ropes, knives, and clubs, their intent clear: to kidnap two people who were nearby. The two people, a man and a woman, were immediately on guard and ready to defend themselves. They were quick and nimble, dodging and weaving as the kidnappers closed in. Despite their best efforts, they were eventually overpowered by the larger, stronger kidnappers. The man was hit with a club and knocked unconscious, while the woman was quickly bound and gagged. The kidnappers were a ruthless group, known for their brutal tactics and complete disregard for human life. They were heavily muscled, with rough, scarred skin and cold, dead eyes. They laughed as they worked, tying up their captives and throwing them over their shoulders. They had a large, flat-bottomed boat waiting in the river, which they used to transport their captives upriver where their camp was located. Despite the odds against them, the two captives refused to give up hope. They struggled against their bonds, desperate to find a way to escape, but their efforts were in vain as the kidnappers were too strong and well-equipped. The man and the woman were taken upriver, into the heart of the kidnappers' territory, never to be seen or heard from again. Gan, Abby, Rady, and Jayla sat around the flickering fire, their faces illuminated by the warm glow. They had been friends since childhood and often found themselves deep in philosophical discussions late into the night. "I can't believe you're getting married, Gan," said Abby, shaking his head in disbelief. "It feels like just yesterday we were running around causing trouble together." Gan chuckled. "Time flies, my man." Jayla, the quietest of the group, spoke up. "Marriage is a significant commitment. It requires a deep love and understanding between two people. Are you sure you are ready for that, Gan?" "I am," replied Gan confidently. "I have found my soulmate, and I am ready to spend the rest of my life with her." Rady, always the joker, interjected. "Well, as long as there is plenty of food and good company, I am happy. That's all I need for a fulfilling life." The group laughed at Rady's jovial nature. Gan's expression grew serious. But seriously, is happiness truly found in material possessions and company? Is that all there is to life? Jayla pondered this for a moment. "I believe true happiness comes from within. It is a state of contentment that cannot be shaken by external circumstances." As the conversation continued, the four friends delved deeper into the mysteries of life and the pursuit of happiness. The fire crackled and popped as they spoke, the warm glow casting shadows on their thoughtful faces. And just like in the rainy season, when the air turns white and the cloud descend on the valley producing a thick fog, a sense of unease settled over the group. There had been rumors of a potential war with a neighboring village, and the prospect of violence weighed heavy on their minds. "I don't understand why we can't just live in peace," said Abi, his voice laced with frustration. "Why must we resort to violence to solve our differences?" Gain nodded in agreement. "I fear that war will bring nothing but destruction and heartache. It is a cowardly act to resort to violence." Jayla spoke up, "But is it not also brave to stand up for what you believe in and protect your loved ones? Is there not a time for bravery in the face of danger?" Rady chimed in. "Bravery is one thing, but there is a fine line between bravery and recklessness. We must be careful not to let our pride cloud our judgment." The group fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire continued to crackle and pop as they sat in contemplative silence. Suddenly, a rustling in the bushes caught their attention. They froze, straining to listen in the darkness. "Who's there?" called out Gan, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his side. There was no response, and after a tense moment, it became clear that it was just a false alarm. The friends let out a sigh of relief and chuckled at their own jumpiness. I guess we are all on edge with the rumors of war, said Jayla. Yes, it's better to be safe than sorry, replied Gan. As the night wore on, the friends returned to their philosophical discussions, the scare quickly forgotten. The next morning, the friends gathered together to help Gan build his new house. They worked tirelessly under the hot sun, their muscles straining as they lifted and carried heavy logs. I can't believe we are doing this all for you, Gan, panted Racy, pausing to wipe the sweat from his brow. You better appreciate it. Gan chuckled. I do, my friend. I am forever grateful for your help and support. As they worked, Rachie couldn't resist telling a crude joke. Hey, have you heard the one about the prostitute with a runny nose? She offered a tissue, but it was a blowjob. The group groaned at the tasteless joke, but Jayla couldn't resist adding a quick comeback. Well, that joke was a real booger. It definitely needed some tissue. Rady rolled his eyes at the pun, but couldn't help laughing along with the rest of the group. Despite the hard work and long hours, the friends were having a great time together. As the day drew to a close and the house began to take shape, the group paused to admire their handiwork. It's going to be a great home, said Gan with a satisfied smile. And it's all thanks to you guys. No problem, replied Avy. That's what friends are for. As the sun set on another day of hard work, the friends headed home, tired but content in the knowledge that they had accomplished something great together. That very same night, the friends decided to go fishing in separate spots along the river. Gan and Abby paired off while Rachie and Jayla went to a different spot downstream. As they cast their lines into the water, the pairs fell into deep conversation. Gan and Abby discussed the importance of family and loyalty, while Rachie and Jayla debated the nature of happiness. But their peaceful evening was interrupted by the sound of a struggle. Gan and Abby turned to see two shadowy figures wrestling with Rachie and Jayla. Kidnappers! Shouted Gan, his heart racing. Without hesitation, he and Abby sprang into action, rushing to their friend's aid. The fight was brutal and violent, with the kidnappers holding the upper hand. Jayla was bleeding from a deep gash on his forehead, and Rachie was struggling to catch his breath. All hope was gone as the kidnappers closed in for the kill. But just when all seemed lost, Gan and Abby arrived to even the odds. The fight that ensued was a desperate and violent struggle, with each side determined to emerge victorious. The sounds of grunts and the clashing of metal filled the air. Gan fought with the strength of a lion, his every blow testament to his bravery. Abby was a blur of motion, his sword flashing through the air like a bolt of lightning. In the end, they emerged victorious, their enemies defeated and lying at their feet. The friends were battered and bruised, but they were alive. As they tended to their wounds and counted their blessings, they knew that they had truly been tested. They had faced the darkest of foes and emerged stronger for it. The all-consuming inferno of battle had burned away any fear or doubt, leaving only a fierce determination in its wake. The next day, the boys went to the elders of the village to report the attempted kidnapping. They were met with skepticism and accusations of drunkenness. You boys have been known to enjoy a drink or two, said one of the elders, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. I find it hard to believe that you were sober enough to accurately witness such an event. Gan's temper flared at the accusation. We may enjoy a drink, but we were sober enough to fight off the kidnappers. We are not spreading false news. But the elders were not convinced. We cannot go spreading panic throughout the village based on the word of 4 young men who were likely under the influence, said another elder sternly. Jayla tried to reason with them, using a parable to illustrate their point. It is like the old saying, a bird does not sing because it has an answer. It sings because it has a song. We are not seeking attention or trying to cause trouble. We are simply telling the truth. But the elders were unmoved. We cannot take action based on the word of 4 young men who were likely not in their right minds, they said. We caution you against spreading false news that could cause panic and fear in the village." The friends left the meeting, frustrated and disappointed, feeling as though they had not been taken seriously. They knew they had to be more careful in the future and find a way to prove the truth of their story. Later that day, Gan sat with his girlfriend's parents, discussing their intentions for the future. The conversation turned to the topic of marriage and the number of wives a man should have. "I plan on having just one wife," said Gan firmly. "I believe in being faithful and devoted to one partner." His girlfriend's father raised an eyebrow. "That is a noble sentiment, but do you not want to carry on your family line and have many children?" Gan shook his head. "I believe that quality is more important than quantity. One strong and loving relationship is worth more than many shallow ones." The conversation shifted to Gan's own family, and he explained that his mother and father had passed away. "I see," said the father, his expression somber. "Death is a great mystery that we may never fully understand. What do you believe happens when we die, Gan?" Gan hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I do not know. Some believe in an afterlife, while others believe that death is simply the end." The father nodded. "I believe that we come back as one of our own descendants. The cycle of life continues, and we are forever connected to our ancestors." As the conversation continued, Gan and his future father-in-law found themselves alone. The older man fixed Gan with a serious gaze. "I must caution you, Gan," he said. "Do not spread the news of the attempted kidnapping. There are those who do not want the truth to be known." Gan nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I understand, but the deaf man knows there is a war when he sees people running. The truth cannot be hidden forever." The father-in-law nodded, a glint of respect in his eyes. "You are wise beyond your years, Gan. I hope you will use your wisdom for the good of the village." Weeks later, the long-awaited wedding took place. The village was alive with the sound of drums and the smell of delicious food. Friends and family gathered to celebrate the union of Gan and his bride. As the sun set, the couple exchanged vows and were pronounced husband and wife. The party continued late into the night, with dancing and feasting long into the early hours. Finally, it was time for Gan to take his bride home. The couple disappeared into the hut, and the partygoers waited expectantly. A few minutes later, Gan emerged with a triumphant grin and a bloodied sheet. The crowd erupted into cheers and congratulations, their joy and celebration reaching a fever pitch. The party continued, fueled by the love and happiness of the newlyweds. It was a joyous and unforgettable night that would be remembered for years to come. Later that night, Gan had a disturbing dream. In the dream, two chickens were fighting over a scrap of food. They pecked and clawed at each other, their feathers flying everywhere. But as Gan watched, the chickens stopped fighting and started eating together. A third chicken joined them, and at first, everything seemed peaceful. However, as the third chicken began to eat, the first two suddenly turned on it, attacking it with ferocity. The third chicken died under their claws, and the first two continued to eat, growing larger and stronger. But the peace was short-lived. Soon, the first two chickens began fighting again. Their once allied forces now turned against each other. The scene was bloody and frightening, and Gan woke up in a cold sweat. As he lay in bed, trying to shake off the remnants of the disturbing dream, Gan couldn't help but wonder what it all meant. Was it a warning of danger to come, or simply a manifestation of his own fears and doubts? Whatever the case, the dream stayed with him long after he had awoken, haunting him with its bloody and violent imagery. The next morning, Gan went to see a medicine man to discuss his disturbing dream. The wise old man listened intently as Gan described the chickens fighting over food, then turning on each other in a bloody frenzy. "I see," said the medicine man, his eyes narrowed in thought. "This dream speaks of cooperation, betrayal, victory, and inevitable death. It is a reminder that nothing in life is certain, and we must be ever vigilant. Gan nodded, trying to understand the meaning of the dream. It is like the old saying, a bird does not sing because it has an answer. It sings because it has a song, continued the medicine man. We must find our own path and not be swayed by the actions of others. And just as the tortoise and the hare learned, we must not let arrogance cloud our judgment, he added. Victory is not always achieved by those who are the strongest or the fastest. Gain listened intently as the medicine man used parables to illustrate his points. Despite the disturbing nature of the dream, he found comfort in the wisdom of the old man. Thank you for your guidance, said Gan, bowing his head in respect. I will remember your words and strive to live a wise and thoughtful life. May your path be clear and your journey be blessed, replied the medicine man, a warm smile on his face. Go now, and may the Great Spirit watch over you. As the years passed, the friends' lives took different paths. Gan became a devoted husband and father, his son bringing him joy and purpose. Gan's son was a handful, full of energy and curiosity. He was constantly getting into mischief, but his wide grin and sparkling eyes melted the hearts of even the sternest disciplinarians. Abby found love and became engaged, his bride, to be a vision of beauty and grace. Her face was as radiant as the sun and her hair as soft as a summer breeze. She moved with the grace of a dancer, her every step a testament to her elegance. Jayla, always seeking knowledge and adventure, set off to the east to study with wise men and learn new skills. Rati remained in the village, using his quick wit and storytelling abilities to entertain the masses. Everyone loved him, and he was never short of adoring fans. As the friends gathered together, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. They had faced challenges and overcome obstacles, and they knew that there were more to come. But they faced the future with hope and determination, knowing that they would always be there for each other no matter what. One day, the three friends were working in the fields with the other villagers when the sound of drums echoed through the air. The men stopped their work and hurried home, their hearts racing with excitement and fear. Gan remembered his dream from years before and couldn't shake the feeling of foreboding. As he joined the other villagers in the central square, he saw that the archers, warriors, elders, drummers, and wrestlers had already gathered. The cooks and maids were packing up their supplies, preparing to march. Then, the village chief and leader appeared, flanked by his bodyguard. The chief addressed the crowd, his voice booming across the square. It is time to defend our village against the aggressors, he said. We must stand together and fight for our families and our homes. Who will join me? The warriors stepped forward, their faces resolute. The archers readied their bows, and the drummers began to beat a fierce rhythm. As the villagers set off, they met another village, similarly prepared for battle. The two groups met on a field, their numbers evenly matched. The chief of the other village approached, his bodyguard at his side. The two chiefs faced off, their sons standing behind them as bodyguards. It was tradition that a chief could bring as many sons as he had to the battlefield, and both chiefs had brought 10 each. The tension was palpable as the two sides faced off, ready to do battle. The fate of their villages hung in the balance, and it was clear that only one side would emerge victorious. As the two sides prepared for battle, an old man from the challenging village walked to the center of the field, leaning on his staff for support. He spoke in a calm and measured voice, stating their grievances. "We come to you today with a simple request," he said. "Our village is downriver while yours is upriver. When it comes to fishing, we are at a disadvantage. The fish pass your village before they reach us, and we are left with nothing. All we ask is that you allow us a fair share of the catch." The old man from the Mandingo village listened patiently, then shook his head. "I understand your concerns, but I must disagree," he said. Fish are everywhere, regardless of the direction of the current. It is not fair to blame one village for the misfortunes of another. We must find a way to coexist and prosper together. The two old men faced off, each determined to defend their village's interests. It was clear that a resolution would not be easy to reach. The fate of the two villages hung in the balance, and the stakes were high. The two village chiefs were surrounded by their respective groups of warriors, each one armed and ready for a potential conflict. The archers, dressed in animal skin tunics, stood in a line, bows drawn, and arrows ready to fly. They were a formidable force, each one a master of the bow and arrow. Behind the archers stood the spearmen, brandishing their long poles and sturdy shields. They were the backbone of the warrior contingent, their courage and strength unmatched. The swordmen stood next to the spearmen, their gloves and gear gleaming in the sun. Each one was a master of the sword, and their presence was felt by all those around them. In the background, the children of the village had cleared a large space, gathering rocks and other debris to make way for the impending battle. They were eager to watch, to see the might and bravery of their elders on display. The two elders stood facing each other, their long robes flowing in the wind. They were the wise men of the villages, and it was their job to keep the peace. They spoke to the audience, their words carrying over the crowd. "We are not our ancestors," the first elder said, "and we will settle our differences through debate, not through war." The second elder nodded in agreement. "If we are still not satisfied with the outcome of the debate," he added, "we will pick our hero for a show of strength. But let war be the last resort." With those words, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the two villages. The drums began to beat, and the warriors took their positions, ready to fight for what they believed in. As the day of the gathering progressed, two groups of philosophers from each village began to engage in a heated debate over the ethics of fish farming, catch and release, and overfishing. The first philosopher from the downriver village spoke passionately about the importance of preserving the natural balance of the river and ensuring that future generations would be able to enjoy its bounties. "We must not take more from the river than it can give," he declared, "for if we do, the river will dry up, and future generations will curse our greed." The philosopher from the upriver village countered by arguing that it was their right to harvest the fish in the river as they saw fit, for the good of their own people. "What right do you have to dictate to us how we should live our lives?" he asked. "The river belongs to all of us, and we have a right to make use of its resources as we see fit." As the debate raged on, the wrestlers took to the field, each determined to prove the strength and skill of their village. They fought with ferocity, neither giving an inch, until finally in a draw that left both warriors exhausted and panting. At last, the two elders stepped forward to address the gathered crowd. The elder from the downriver village spoke first. "A compromise has been reached," he announced. "The elder from the upriver village has agreed to give his most beautiful daughter in marriage to the son of the elder from my village, thus uniting our two villages in peace." The crowd murmured as they considered the significance of this announcement. Some suspected that the entire conflict had been a ruse, staged simply to arrange this engagement. The daughter of the upriver village was truly a vision to behold. Her skin was a rich, warm brown, and her eyes sparkled like diamonds in the sun. Her hair was long and luxurious, falling in soft, gleaming waves down her back. She was a true beauty, the embodiment of grace and strength. Her name was Sheba. The son of the downriver village was no less impressive. He was tall and broad, shouldered, with skin as black as the night sky. His eyes were deep and expressive, and his smile lit up the field like a beacon of hope. His name was Flamoko. As the celebration broke out, with food, dancing, and music filling the air, the two newly engaged lovers stood at the center of it all, beaming with joy and surrounded by the love and well wishes of their people. It was a day that would be remembered for generations to come, a testament to the power of peace, understanding, and the enduring bond of love. As time passed, both villages worked together to farm the land and fish in the river. They cooperated and shared their resources, and their friendship grew stronger. A marketplace was built between the two villages, and it quickly became a hub of activity. People from both villages came to trade goods and share news. The market thrived and benefited everyone, bringing wealth and prosperity to the entire region. People gathered at the market to spread rumors and gossip, exchanging tales of their own experiences, sharing what they had heard from others. One day, a rumor spread that there had been a kidnapping in one of the villages. People whispered nervously, exchanging worried glances. Rady, the storyteller, took the stage and hushed the crowd. He had heard the rumor and wanted to tell them what he knew. "Listen, my friends," he said in a dramatic voice. "I have a story to tell you of a brave and daring attempt at kidnapping in one of our villages." The crowd grew quiet, all ears and eyes focused on Reishi. "It was a moonless night," he began, "and the village was quiet except for the sound of the river flowing and the hut of an owl in the distance. A young woman, the daughter of one of the elders, was targeted by a group of thieves from a neighboring village. They had heard of her beauty and wealth and thought to take advantage of the situation. They snuck into the village under cover of darkness, armed with knives and clubs. Rady paused, letting the suspense build. But the young woman was brave and resourceful. She raised the alarm, waking her father and the other villagers. They banded together and chased the thieves away, sending them running back to their village with their tails between their legs. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, impressed by the young woman's bravery. Reishi smiled, enjoying the reaction of his audience. "This is a reminder to us all," he said, "that we must always be vigilant and ready to defend our families and our communities. We must work together to keep each other safe and secure." The crowd nodded in agreement, proud of their villages and their communities. The attempted kidnapping became a tale of bravery and unity, reminding everyone of the importance of working together and supporting one another. The rumors of the kidnapping soon faded away, replaced by new stories and new adventures. Jayla returned to the African village after years of traveling to the east, and his appearance was a shock to the locals. He wore clothes that were unfamiliar to the village people, a long tunic and pants made of fine silk, embroidered with gold and silver thread. His head was covered with a turban made of soft, colorful fabric. He carried a cane made of polished wood with a silver knob at the top. His skin was dark, but he had a certain exotic look to him that was different from the people in the village. As Jayla walked through the village, people stared at him in disbelief, whispering to each other and pointing. He stood out like a sore thumb among the simple people who wore traditional clothing made of animal skins and beads. However, his confidence and air of sophistication gave him an air of superiority over the people around him. Rady, who had been eagerly waiting for Jayla's return, saw him from a distance and ran up to him. Rady, in contrast to Jayla, was dressed in a simple robe made of animal skin and had no shoes on his feet. His skin was dark and weathered from years of working in the fields. His hair was long and unkempt, tied back in a rough ponytail. Reishi was excited to see Jayla and asked him questions about his travels to the east. As Jayla and Reishi walked away to have a long discussion, the differences between them were even more evident. Jayla spoke in a calm and measured tone, while Reishi was excited and spoke with passion. Jayla had a wealth of knowledge and experience, having traveled to distant lands and seen new things, while Reishi had lived his whole life in the same village and knew only what he had been taught. Despite their differences, however, they shared a bond of friendship and respect. Jayla had been like a mentor to Ratzi, and Reishi had looked up to him with admiration. As they walked and talked, their differences faded away, and they were just two men enjoying each other's company. One day, Jayla gathered the villagers together and addressed them. "My friends, I have come to you with a warning. Rumors have reached us of kidnappings happening in other villages. and I fear that our own village is not immune. We must act to prevent these heinous crimes from happening in our midst." Jayla continued, "I have seen many things in my travels, and I have learned that the best defense against danger is preparation. I propose that we start a training program for our young people so that they may be ready to investigate the kidnappings, to prevent them, and to rescue potential victims." The elders listened to Jayla's words and took them to heart. They agreed that his proposal was wise, and they set about making arrangements to put Jayla's plan into action. As the preparations were underway, Jayla took the opportunity to offer a warning to the villagers in the form of a parable. "My friends, I tell you this, the ant who is unprepared will suffer in the rain, while the ant who prepares will thrive. So too, those who are prepared will be able to withstand the dangers that may come their way, while those who are not will be swept away." Jayla's words struck a chord with the villagers, and they worked hard to implement his training program. The villagers felt safer knowing that they were taking steps to protect themselves and their loved ones, and they looked forward to a brighter future in which they would be prepared for any danger that may come their way. Rati had always been a bit of a wild card in the village, known for his love of drink and his tendency to embellish his stories. Many of the elders had long since stopped taking him seriously, but when he stumbled into the village square one afternoon, wild-eyed and breathless, insisting that he had seen a white person for the first time in his life, the elders couldn't ignore him. Oga, one of the wisest and most respected elders in the village, approached Reishi skeptically. "Reishi," he said, his voice stern, "what is it that you're trying to tell us?" Reishi took a deep breath and launched into his tale, describing the stranger he had encountered in the jungle, a man with skin as pale as the moon and hair as red as fire. But as he spoke, Oga's expression grew increasingly incredulous. "Reishi, this is madness," he said, cutting him off. "White people are nothing but myth, stories told to scare children. They don't exist in the real world." Reishi stood his ground, however. "I know what I saw, Oga," he insisted, "and I'm telling you, this man was real. I swear it on my life." Oga shook his head, clearly unconvinced. "Reishi, I've known you for many years now," he said, his voice heavy with frustration, "and I know that you're prone to exaggerating your stories, shall we say. I find it hard to believe that you would be able to distinguish between reality and drunken fancy." Reishi's face darkened with anger, but he refused to back down. "I'm not lying, Oga," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I saw him with my own two eyes, and if you don't believe me, I suggest you go see for yourself." Oga considered this for a moment, his gaze flicking back and forth between Reishi and the gathered crowd. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "Very well," he said. "If you insist that this stranger is real, then I will go see for myself. But I suggest you be prepared for the possibility that you might be proven wrong, Reishi." With that, Oga turned and strode off into the jungle, leaving Reishi and the rest of the village to await his return. Whether or not Reishi was telling the truth remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: the events of that day would have far-reaching consequences for the entire village. Oga stumbled out of the village courtyard, surrounded by a crowd of curious onlookers. The people were in awe of the bravery he displayed as he ventured into the unknown jungle. "He's so brave," said one woman in the crowd. "What if he doesn't come back?" Oga didn't let their fears stop him. He forged ahead, entering the dense jungle and being enveloped by its sights and sounds. The thick trees blocked out much of the sun, and the sounds of exotic birds and animals filled the air. Oga trudged forward, his senses on high alert as he searched for any signs of the white-skinned man he was sent to find. After what felt like hours, he finally caught a glimpse of something, lying motionless on the ground. With a burst of energy, Oga rushed over to what turned out to be a naked woman, quickly assessing her condition. She was alive, but barely. He scooped her up in his arms and carried her back to the village, where the crowd eagerly awaited their arrival. As Oga approached the courtyard, the people pressed in, eager to hear the woman's tale. What happened to her, they asked. Why was she in the jungle all alone? Oga simply shook his head, not wanting to speak until the woman was safely in the care of the village elders. As they took her away, the people buzzed with excitement and speculation, wondering what kind of danger the woman had faced and how Oga had managed to save her. The woman, trembling and exhausted, stood before the village elders, recounting the harrowing journey that had led her to their shores. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke of her capture and the days she spent shackled and confined on the canoe, heading towards a massive boat that she couldn't even imagine. But then, in a moment of desperation, she had taken a leap of faith and jumped into the water, the chains around her neck breaking free. I didn't know if I would survive, but I just wanted to escape, she said, her voice shaking. I swam as far as I could, and somehow I made it to shore. I ran as fast as I could, knowing that they would be in pursuit. The elders listened skeptically as the woman described her journey, fleeing day and night from mysterious white-skinned people who were tracking her every move. She spoke of the fear that consumed her and the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her at every turn. I don't know how I made it this far, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. I just kept running and praying that I would find a safe place. One of the elders spoke up, a note of doubt in his voice. Your story is hard to believe, young woman. There have been only one report of white-skinned people in these parts. This was told to us by Reishi, and his reputation for sobriety is not well known. The woman's eyes widened in shock and anger, and she began to protest. But the elder held up his hand to silence her. We will need to verify your story before we can offer any aid. Until then, you will have to remain here, under guard. The woman fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she wept for the life she had lost and the journey that had led her to this place. Not too long later, a stranger stumbled into the village. The man's name was Kofi, and he sat before the village elders with tears streaming down his face. His body trembled as he recounted out the horrific tale of his kidnapping and how he was the only one to survive. It was dark, and I was fishing with my family on the riverbank. Kofi began, his voice quivering. Suddenly, we were surrounded by a group of strange men. They were armed with clubs and ropes, and they didn't hesitate to attack us. We fought back with everything we had, but they were too strong. They overpowered us, tied us up, and took us away. I don't know where they took us, but it was a place of darkness and despair. I was kept in a small, cramped cell with no light. I was beaten and starved. I lost track of time, and I thought I would never see the sun again. But then, one night, I heard a commotion outside my cell. I saw a glimmer of light, and I knew that my chance had come. I fought back with all my strength and managed to escape. I ran for miles and finally stumbled back into our village, but I was too late. My family was gone. Elder, I am consumed by grief and fear, Kofi continued, his voice breaking. I must find out what happened to my family and bring them home. The elder listened sympathetically, and he could see the fear and determination in Kofi's eyes. He knew that Kofi would stop at nothing to find his loved ones and bring them back. I will do everything in my power to help you, Kofi, the elder said. We will not rest until your family is returned to you. Kofi wept for his lost family and vowed revenge against the kidnappers. He knew that it would not be easy, but he was determined to find the truth and bring his family back, no matter what it took. It was a beautiful day in the village, with the sun shining bright and the birds chirping. But that all changed in an instant. Suddenly, the drums sounded, signaling that something was wrong. The villagers quickly gathered, only to find out that the village had been raided. The raid on the African village was sudden and chaotic. People scrambled to find hiding places, some diving under beds, others squeezing behind large clay pots. Children cried. Mothers clutched them tight, praying for their safety. One man, Musa, bravely faced the attackers head-on, dodging and weaving through the chaos, throwing punches and kicks with all his might. He had the upper hand, landing powerful blows on his opponents when suddenly a mysterious white-skinned man appeared. Musa hesitated for a moment, distracted by the unusual sight, but it was all the advantage his attackers needed. They tackled him, knocking him unconscious and capturing him. The same scenario played out 4 more times as the attackers chased down their victims, overpowered them, and took them captive. The village was in chaos, with the sounds of shouting and fighting ringing out through the night. Homes were set on fire, casting a warm, flickering glow over the scene. Women and children wailed, begging for mercy. Amidst the chaos, the attackers were relentless, continuing their pursuit until they had captured all that they came for. The once peaceful village was left in shambles, with families torn apart and homes destroyed. The enemy had taken many of their own, including Gan's child. Gan was a tall, muscular man with a shaved head and a deep voice. His skin was a rich, dark brown, and he had a prominent nose and full lips. He wore a simple cloth wrap around his waist and a beaded necklace, which he always wore as a reminder of his late father. Gan's wife, whose name was Aisha, was a beautiful woman with long braided hair and a warm smile. She had a lighter complexion than Gan, with smooth, creamy skin, and wore a colorful headscarf and a beaded necklace like her husband. Aisha was beloved by the village for her gentle nature and her skill as a weaver. Gan had a wonderful relationship with his in-laws, often spending long evenings sitting around the fire with them, talking and laughing. He would share stories of his travels and experiences, and they would tell him about life in the village and their hopes for the future. One of Gan's greatest joys was spending time with his son, Fia. He would take the young boy out to the river to fish, teaching him how to tie a knot and cast a line. He showed him how to set traps to catch lizards and other small creatures, and how to identify different plants and animals in the surrounding forest. When the day was done, Gan and Fia would often join the other villagers around the fire to listen to Reishi tell stories. Fia would sit wide-eyed, mesmerized by the tales of adventure and intrigue. As the days passed, Fia grew more and more involved in the daily life of the village. He would help his mother with chores and take on his own tasks, like setting traps for small game and helping to harvest the cassava. Meanwhile, Gan would spend long hours in the fields, working tirelessly in the hot sun to bring in a good harvest. One evening, as the sun began to set, the village was suddenly thrown into chaos. The sound of distant drums reached their ears, and soon the sky was filled with a deep reddish glow that seemed to be coming from the direction of the village. Men and women stopped their work and began to run towards the village, their faces twisted in fear and panic. The vast battlefield was a sight of horror and destruction. Corpses littered the ground as far as the eye could see, like fallen leaves in a forest after a heavy storm. The stench of death and decay filled the air, making it difficult to breathe. The campfires of the opposing forces still smoldered, adding to the smoke that hung low in the sky like a thick, heavy fog. Scavenging birds and dogs roamed the battlefield, searching for scraps of food amongst the dead. They cawed and barked as they fought over scraps, their cries echoing across the field of death. In the distance, vultures circled overhead, waiting patiently for their turn at the feast. The ground was stained red with blood, and weapons of war lay scattered about like toys. Swords and shields, arrows and spears, all forgotten in the chaos of battle. The silence was broken only by the shuffling of the scavengers and the occasional snap of a dry twig. The violence on this battlefield was like a raging fire, consuming everything in its path. The warring factions had become so consumed by their hatred that they couldn't see the destruction they were causing. They were like 2 opposing rivers, each flowing with their own strength and power. colliding in a brutal and deadly battle for control. But in the end, there was no winner. Only death and destruction remained. The battlefield was a reminder of the consequences of war, a warning to all who would seek to follow in the same path. It was a somber and haunting scene, one that would linger in the memory of those who saw it for many years to come. Gan ran with all his might, dodging the other workers as they struggled to keep up. Some ran as though they had heavy blocks tied to their feet, their weariness weighing them down. Others ran with their hearts pounding in their chests, the fear of what was happening propelling them forward. Gan ran like a gazelle, his feet barely touching the ground. As he sprinted towards his house, he saw a woman, her clothes on fire, running towards him. He didn't hesitate to scoop her up and carry her to safety. She told him her baby was still in the burning house. Gan rushed inside and found the baby, carrying it out just as the roof collapsed. He continued towards his house, where he found his wife injured but alive. Gan was torn between staying with her and finding his son, but his wife urged him to hurry and find Fia. She told him what happened. The pale-faced man and his black-faced demons had come and taken Fia. Most of the villagers were too afraid to give chase, so Gan ran after the kidnappers. As he caught up, he came face to face with the pale-faced man. He was dressed in strange clothes, a wide-brimmed hat on his head and strange shoes on his feet. The man pointed what Gan assumed was a stick or club towards him. There was a loud boom, like lightning striking, and Gan fell to the ground. Rati, hidden in the bushes, watched in horror. The pale-faced man disappeared into the night. Rati's heart was heavy with sorrow as he approached the still body of Gan. He had been lying there in the grass, lifeless, his eyes staring off into the distance. Rati couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt wash over him. If he had only been there to help, maybe things would have turned out differently. As he made his way to Gan's home, Rati's heart sank even further. The door was wide open, and inside, he could see the lifeless body of Gan's wife. Her bloodied form lay motionless on the floor, a silent witness to the horror that had taken place. Rati knew that he had to be strong, even though his heart was heavy with grief. He had to find the missing child. With a heavy heart, he made his way through the village, searching high and low for any sign of the missing boy. But all he found were empty houses and signs of struggle. As the hours ticked by, Rati began to lose hope. He had searched every inch of the village, but there was no sign of the child. His mind raced with questions. Where could the kidnappers have taken him? Was there any hope of finding him alive? As he wandered through the village, a sense of foreboding began to settle over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone or something was lurking in the shadows. His senses were on high alert, and every rustling leaf or snapping twig made him jump with fear. But even in the midst of his fear and uncertainty, Rati knew that he had to keep searching. He couldn't let Gan's child become just another statistic, another victim of the cruel slave trade. With a heavy heart and a determined spirit, Rati continued his search, determined to bring the child back to his people. Rati sat alone in his small, dimly lit hut, staring blankly at the wall. His mind was clouded with the memory of the tragic events that had unfolded in the village earlier that day. He could still hear the screams of the villagers and the deafening sound of the lightning bolt that had struck down Gan. Feeling numb and helpless, Rati reached for the jug of palm wine that he had hidden away in his small cupboard. He had been a drinker before, but tonight was different. The weight of his grief was too much to bear, and he needed to numb the pain. He took a long swig from the jug, wincing at the bitterness of the wine as it burned down his throat. For a moment, the taste and the feeling of the alcohol shocked him, but he quickly took another gulp, feeling the warmth of the drink spread through his body. As he continued to drink, Rati felt his thoughts become hazy and his emotions dulled. He began to lose himself in the sensation of the alcohol, welcoming the escape it offered from his pain. The flickering light of the oil lamp cast long shadows across the room, and the sound of the night creatures outside filled the air. Reishi sat there in silence, lost in his own thoughts and drowning in the comforting numbness of the alcohol. The elders of the village had gathered together, their voices raised in heated debate. At the center of the argument was an elder named Musa, a man with a weather-worn face and wise eyes that hinted at years of experience. "We must act now," Musa shouted, his arms gesturing wildly. "We cannot wait for the enemy to strike again. We must take the fight to them." "And how do you propose we do that?" asked another elder, a man named Luma who was known for his skepticism. "Their numbers are too great, their weapons too powerful." "I have a plan," Musa said, his voice growing calmer as he leaned forward, his eyes shining with determination. "A select group of people will let themselves be captured. They will leave behind hints and clues for our warriors to follow, and when the time is right, we will launch a rescue from the inside and outside." The other elders nodded, considering the proposal. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained skeptical. One elder named Adama spoke up, a man with a deep, resounding voice. "We must weigh the pros and cons of this suicide mission," he said. "We cannot risk our people without considering the consequences." The debate continued for hours, with each elder offering their own perspective and experiences. But in the end, it was a parable told by Luma that made the decision for them. "We have no choice," he said, his voice echoing through the crowd. "The enemy grows stronger every day, and if we do not act now, it will be too late." There once was a man who spent his whole life planning for the future. He saved his money and worked hard, always thinking about the next step in his life. But he never took any risks, never did anything unexpected or exciting. And then one day he died, and all of his careful planning was for nothing. The people listened to the Luma's words and understood his warning. But one among them was still determined to continue planning, considering all options and risks. This was Adama. The elder Adama then shared a parable. There was a man who decided to swim across a vast ocean. He planned and prepared for months, but he never once tested his swimming abilities in a pool or a lake. When he finally set out to sea, he quickly realized that he had vastly underestimated the power of the ocean, and he was swept away by the waves. The people listened to this cautionary tale with wide eyes, understanding that the elder was warning them against the dangers of reckless action without proper preparation. The elder then spoke directly to the young men who still clung to their plan. "Your plan is like swimming across an ocean. It may be a suicide mission, and you must be prepared for the consequences. Take time to prepare and consider every possible outcome. But do not spend so much time planning that you never take action. You must find a balance between preparation and action." The elders told the story of a loved one who was kidnapped, their heartache and loss told through an allegory. The crowd listened, their eyes filled with tears, their hearts filled with determination. And then, Commander Flomoko stepped forward, his muscular frame towering over the crowd. He looked out over the audience, a proud smile spreading across his face. "I have put together an army that is the pride of this village," he said, his voice filled with confidence. "And I tell you now, Jayla has returned from the east with knowledge that can help us. We will defeat the enemy, and we will bring our people home." The audience erupted into cheers, their hope and joy palpable in the air. But in the background, standing alone and unnoticed, was Sheba. She rubbed her stomach, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and longing as she thought about the child growing inside her and the part she was about to play in the coming conflict. The villagers of the African village were in a state of panic and fear. A young child had been taken from his home in the dead of night, and the villagers were determined to bring him back. The elders of the village called for a rescue party to be assembled, and the task of leading it fell to Flomoko, the bravest warrior of the village. Flomoko assembled a group of warriors, including the skilled tracker, Seze. Seze was known throughout the village as the best tracker in the land, and Flomoko knew that if anyone could find the child, it was him. As the rescue party set out, the fear in everyone's heart was palpable. The thought of a child being taken from their home and possibly in danger was a fear they all shared. Flomoko pushed on, determined to find the child and bring him back to safety. Seize led the way, his trained eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the kidnappers. He found a broken branch, a disturbed patch of dirt, and a faint scent on the wind. He followed the trail with precision, never once losing the trail. The group followed him, their hearts racing with each step they took deeper into the jungle. Suddenly, Seize raised his hand and the group came to a halt. "We're close," he whispered, his voice low and intense. The group readied themselves for a fight, knowing that they were getting closer to the kidnappers. As they approached a small clearing, they could hear shouting and the sounds of a struggle. They burst into the clearing, swords raised, and found themselves face to face with the kidnappers. The man who had taken the child was a white-skinned mercenary, and he had 4 other prisoners with him. Flomoko and his warriors charged forward, their swords flashing in the dim light of the jungle. The kidnappers fought back fiercely, but the rescue party was determined. They fought with all their might, determined to bring the child back to safety. The clash of the 2 warring parties was a brutal display of violence and power. On one side stood an army equipped with bow and arrows, while on the other side was a group of warriors wielding a combination of spears, staffs, shields, and swords. The archers on one side were dressed in rough-spun robes, with their quivers slung over their backs. They moved with agility, knocking arrows and releasing them with deadly precision. The arrows flew through the air, whistling as they zipped towards their targets. Some found their mark, embedding deep into flesh and bone, while others fell short, embedding themselves in the ground or deflecting off the shields of the opposing side. The spearmen on the other side were heavily armored, with plate steel shoulder guards and helmets that glinted in the sunlight. They carried long, sturdy spears that they used to parry the arrows coming at them. The wooden shields they carried were adorned with intricate carvings and paintings, symbolizing the bravery and honor of their respective clans. The swordmen were a force to be reckoned with. They were dressed in leather and chainmail, with their swords strapped to their waists. The swords were razor-sharp and glimmered in the sun. The swordmen moved with grace, their swords a blur as they battled their enemies. As the 2 sides clashed, the sounds of steel on steel and the cries of the wounded filled the air. The ground shook as the warriors battled, their weapons clashing in a chaotic symphony of violence. Bodies fell, littering the ground with broken and bloodied corpses. The smell of death and decay was overpowering, with the carrion birds and wild dogs circling overhead, waiting to feast on the fallen. The violence of the battlefield was a testament to the destructive power of war. It was as if the very earth was rebelling against the violence being inflicted upon it, with the ground itself turning red with the blood of the fallen. It was a scene of chaos and destruction, a symbol of the toll that conflict can take on the world. However, the rescue mission was not meant to be. The enemy had fortified their village, and Flomoko's team was met with heavy resistance. Arrows rained down on them from all sides, and they were forced to retreat. In the heat of the battle, Flomoko was separated from the rest of his team, and he found himself facing the enemy leader alone. The 2 men engaged in a fierce battle, each determined to emerge victorious. In the end, Flomoko emerged victorious, but at a great cost. He was badly injured and had lost many of his comrades in the battle. Seize was just a 15-year-old boy, slim and handsome, but with a fire in his eyes that betrayed the trauma he had endured. He was from a small, isolated village on the outskirts of the war-torn region, but his life was forever changed. One fateful night when the kidnappers descended upon his home with brutal force. Seize was hiding in the riverbank, watching in horror as his family was torn away from him. He could hear the sounds of the huts being burned to ashes, the cries of his neighbors as they were taken away, and the shattering of artifacts that had been passed down for generations. The once peaceful village was now nothing more than a smoldering reminder of the violence that had taken place. Desperate to escape the same fate as his family and friends, Seze made a run for it. He didn't know where he was going or what would happen to him, but he knew that he couldn't stay in the village. So he ran, his feet pounding against the hard earth, his heart pounding in his chest. When Seze stumbled into a neighboring village, he was taken in by the commander of the local army, Commander Flomoko. Despite his initial reservations about the boy, Commander Flomoko saw something in Seze, something that he could mold and shape into a fierce warrior. Seze's life changed again as he was conscripted into Commander Flomoko's army. He was trained in the ways of war, taught how to use weapons and how to fight. He became a soldier, but he never forgot his past and the brutal raid on his village that had taken everything from him. As Seze fought in battles, he saw the same violence and destruction that had taken place in his village, repeated over and over again. He saw the same fear in the eyes of the villagers, the same pain in the cries of the wounded, and the same desperation in the eyes of the soldiers. But despite all of this, he also saw something that gave him hope, something that kept him fighting. The unwavering determination to never let something like that happen again. The raid on Seze's village had broken him, but it had also made him into a new person. He was no longer the scared boy he once was, but a hardened soldier, determined to make a difference in a world filled with violence and fear. He had overcome the odds and survived, and he was ready to do whatever it took to ensure that no other village would have to endure the same fate as his. Commander Flomoko was an imposing figure, his muscles bulging from years of fighting and training. He was tall and broad, shouldered, with a stern look that commanded respect from everyone around him. But despite his fierce exterior, there was also a softness in his eyes that betrayed a hidden kindness. Flomoko was the son of the village chief, born from a marriage between two different villages. He'd grown up with a deep understanding of the complexities of inter-village relationships and the importance of unity in times of war. It was this understanding that led him to take Seze under his wing and train him in the ways of war. The training was intense, with Seze learning the bow and arrow first. Commander Flomoko was a master of the bow, and he spent hours every day teaching Seze the nuances of shooting and tracking. The training was grueling, with Seze pushing himself to his limits, but he was determined to become a skilled warrior, just like his mentor. After mastering the bow, Seze moved on to the sword and shield. To everyone's surprise, he was a natural, his quick reflexes and keen eye allowing him to anticipate his opponent's moves before they even made them. Commander Flomoko was proud of Seze's progress, and he pushed him even harder, knowing that his protege had the potential to become one of the greatest warriors of their time. Years passed as the training continued, and Seze grew stronger and more confident with each passing day. But just as he was about to reach the pinnacle of his training, a new threat emerged. The commander's wife, a beautiful but cunning woman, had set her sights on Seze. She saw something in the young warrior that her husband lacked, and she was determined to have him, no matter what the cost. The tension between Seze and the commander's wife grew with each passing day, until it was clear that a confrontation was inevitable. Seze was torn. He had grown to respect and trust Commander Flomoko, but he also couldn't deny the intense attraction he felt towards the wife. He was caught in the middle of a dangerous game, one that threatened to destroy everything he had worked so hard to achieve. Sheba was a vision of beauty, with a complexion as smooth as silk and curves that would make any man weak in the knees. Her eyes were a deep, dark brown, like pools of melted chocolate, and her hair was long and thick, cascading down her back in a waterfall of black. She was a woman of grace and poise, with an elegance that seemed to radiate from within. But despite her beauty, Sheba was not happy with her husband, Commander Flomoko. He was a man who took what he wanted, including the household servants, and she felt like just another possession in his long list of acquisitions. They had not had relations in months, and she was growing increasingly restless and unsatisfied. It was on one such restless day that Sheba first laid eyes on Seze. He was a young, handsome warrior with a strength and determination that made her heart flutter. She saw in him a fire that her husband lacked, and she was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. Sheba began to seduce Seze slowly but surely until he was completely under her spell. They began a passionate affair, one that was both dangerous and exhilarating. But as the days passed, Sheba became more and more obsessed with Seze, wanting to possess him completely. And as she did, she began to plot a way to get rid of her husband and claim Seze for herself. Seze was now a full-fledged warrior, trained in the art of the bow and arrow, sword and shield. He accompanied Commander Flomoko on many missions, serving as his right-hand man and trusted advisor. One day, the commander addressed a crowd of young men who had gathered to hear his call to arms. "There is a war brewing," he declared, "a war with the kidnappers who seek to take what is not theirs, to enslave our people and destroy our way of life. I am on a mission to recruit as many warriors as I can, to train them, to arm them, and to send them into battle." The men in the crowd stirred, their hearts beating with excitement and fear. They had heard of the commander's reputation, of his skill in battle and his bravery. They knew that joining his army was a risk, but it was also a chance to prove their own courage and to defend their families and their homes. One by one, the men stepped forward, lining up to join the warriors. They were young and old, tall and short, strong and weak, but they were united in their determination to fight. The commander took them to a vast training camp, deep in the heart of the jungle. There, they spent months learning the art of war, honing their skills and preparing for battle. Seze was there too, leading the training, pushing the men to their limits, and showing them what it truly meant to be a warrior. As the months went by, the army under Commander Flomoko continued to expand and evolve. The young men who had joined the cause had been transformed into a Kohag unit, capable of tracking the enemy and gathering intelligence with incredible efficiency. One day, they received word of the enemy's location, a sprawling port where the kidnappers had set up camp. The warriors, led by Commander Flomoko and Seze, set out on a reconnaissance mission, determined to gather as much information as they could. As they approached the port, they could see the sheer size of the enemy camp. Tents and makeshift shelters dotted the landscape, and the sounds of clanging metal and shouting soldiers filled the air. The smell of smoke and roasting meat hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the peace and serenity of the African savanna. The warriors carefully approached, keeping to the shadows as they observed the enemy. They saw soldiers from far-off lands, their pale skin and unfamiliar uniforms standing out among the sea of brown and green. They saw countless people in chains, shuffling to and fro under the watchful gaze of the enemy soldiers. The sight of their own people, captured and treated like animals, filled the warriors with a burning anger. They had trained for this moment, had prepared themselves for the day when they would face the enemy and reclaim what was rightfully theirs. And now that day had finally arrived. The warriors carefully made their way back to their own camp, eager to report their findings to Commander Flomoko and plan their next move. They were more determined than ever to win this war, to free their people and restore peace to their land. The outside of the hut was a sight to behold. It was made of a mixture of mud and wood, crafted with the utmost care and precision. The walls were smooth, and the roof was thatched with thick palm fronds, providing ample shade for those inside. Stepping inside the hut, one was immediately struck by the beauty and warmth of the interior. There were several rooms, each with its own unique charm and character. Natural light filtered in through small vents in the roof, illuminating the space and highlighting the intricate artwork adorning the walls. At the center of the hut was a bed, unlike anything anyone in the village had ever seen. It was covered in rare feathers, so soft that it felt as if one was sleeping on clouds. Sheba lay on the bed, her thoughts deep and brooding as she gazed out of the window. Despite the comfort of her surroundings, she was troubled by the events that had recently transpired and the path that lay ahead. Seize and Commander Flomoko trained hard with sword and shield, their bodies glistening with sweat under the light of the setting sun. The clang of metal echoed through the clearing as they strike and parry with precise and practiced movements. Blow by blow, the two men pushed each other to their limits. Near misses were frequent, each one trying to anticipate the other's next move. Seize, with his quick reflexes, was a match for Flomoko's raw strength. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Seize started to tire. He took a step back, breathing heavily. "I need a break," he said, wiping the sweat from his brow. Flomoko, determined to continue, nodded his head in understanding. "Take a moment," he said. "I'll keep going." Seize watched as his mentor continued to train, each movement becoming more fluid as the sun disappeared behind the trees. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the man who had taken him under his wing and trained him in the art of the bow and arrow. But as Seize turned to leave, he was stopped by a soft voice. "Seize, I need to see you." It was Sheba, the commander's wife. Seize followed her to a secluded spot where she revealed the shocking news. She was pregnant. She told him that she had not been intimate with her husband, Flomoko, and there was no way the child could be his. Seize realized with a heavy heart that he was the father. "I feel such guilt," he said. "I've betrayed the man who took me in and trained me. I'm the last of my bloodline, and I'm torn between my happiness at becoming a father and my loyalty to Flomoko." Sheba, with a calm and reassuring voice, told Seize that she had a plan. She pulled out a leaf filled with a dry powder and explained her intention to use it to cover up their affair. "We can be together, Seize, without anyone ever knowing," she said. Seize was filled with equal parts fear and hope. He knew the risks involved, but he couldn't deny the happiness that filled his heart at the thought of being with Sheba and raising their child together. The night was filled with tension and uncertainty as they discussed their next steps, their future hanging in the balance. Abby and his wife were in deep debate over whether to flee their village. The rumors of war and kidnapping had reached an all-time high, and the couple couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The news of other families being taken in the night was all they could think about as they lay in bed at night. They couldn't ignore the fact that they were next. "Abby, we must leave," his wife said to him, her voice filled with urgency. "We have to take our children and get as far away from here as possible." Abby sighed deeply. He was torn between his love for his village and his love for his family. "Where would we go?" he asked. "East," his wife replied without hesitation. "The stories say it's safer there, and we can start over." Abby nodded, and the two of them went to work packing their belongings secretly. They didn't want to alarm their neighbors and cause a panic, so they packed in the dead of night, hoping to leave without anyone noticing. The next morning, when Abby and his family were nowhere to be found, the villagers were in a state of panic. Some believed they had been taken in the night like so many others, while others thought they had run away. A search party was quickly assembled, and their trail was followed. The signs pointed to a rival village, and a group of men fueled by anger and a desire for revenge put together a raiding party. They were going to get their loved ones back and make the rival village pay. The raid was a fierce and brutal affair. The sound of war drums echoed through the jungle as the villagers descended upon the rival village. The clash of metal on metal, the screams of the wounded, and the smoke of burning huts filled the air. The satisfaction of revenge was short-lived, however, as Abby and his family suddenly reappeared. The shock and disappointment were palpable, and the villagers were left to ponder what had happened. Abby and his wife explained that they had only gone to visit a sick relative, and they were horrified to hear of the raid. The villagers were ashamed of their actions, and the raid was quickly forgotten. Abby and his family were welcomed back with open arms, and life in the village went back to normal. But the memory of the raid stayed with them all, a reminder of the danger that lurked just outside the village gates. Rady stumbled around the bustling marketplace, his steps unsteady and his speech slurred. People laughed and pointed at the drunk man, exchanging snickering comments about his state. "Look at Rady. He can barely stand up straight." One man jeered, holding his nose as Reishi stumbled past. Despite the mocking, Reishi was convinced he had a tale to tell. "You wouldn't believe it," he slurred, trying to grab the attention of anyone who would listen. "I fought off a group of kidnappers all by myself. I'm a hero." The market goers only laughed harder, openly mocking Reishi's wild claims. "A hero, more like a fool," one woman chided. An elderly man approached Reishi, shaking his head at the spectacle. "Reishi, your actions remind me of the foolish monkey who stumbled into the fire," the wise man began, speaking in a parable. He danced and celebrated, not realizing the harm he was causing himself. "Just like you, Reishi, your drunkenness is leading you down a dangerous path." Reidi's laughter faded, and he broke down in tears, his drunken rant turning into sobs. "I've seen the end of everything," he cried. "The end of our village, the end of our people. What will become of us?" The wise man placed a comforting hand on Reidi's shoulder. "Do not fear the future, Reishi. Remember the wisdom of the ant, who prepared for the raining season while the grasshopper played. Take control of your life and make positive changes for a better tomorrow." The sun was just beginning to rise over the African village as a sense of fear and urgency overtook the residents. They were being raided, and the villagers were quickly trying to find places to hide. Amidst the chaos, a man named Kofi was frantically searching for his children, shouting their names and calling out to them. As he turned a corner, Kofi was suddenly confronted by a group of kidnappers who were determined to capture him. He put up a fierce fight using all his strength and agility to fend them off. For a moment, it seemed like Kofi was getting the upper hand. But then a mysterious white-skinned man appeared on the scene. Kofi was momentarily distracted by the stranger's unexpected arrival, giving the kidnappers an opening to capture him. Kofi struggled with all his might, but the kidnappers were too strong and he was quickly overpowered and captured. With the man in their possession, the kidnappers started to make their way out of the village. But Kofi was not about to give up that easily. He managed to escape from his captors and started running back towards where he believed his children were hiding. The kidnappers were hot on his heels, but Kofi was determined to save his children. As he got closer, he could hear the cries of fear and desperation. Just as the kidnappers were about to find them, Kofi managed to distract them by drawing their attention to himself. Kofi's bravery and selflessness allowed his children to escape to safety, but it also cost him his freedom. The kidnappers captured him once again, and he was taken away to an unknown fate. The sounds of Kofi's screams echoed throughout the village, reminding the residents of the terrible raid and the bravery of those who fought to protect their loved ones. Kofi felt every bump and jolt as he was dragged along, his arms tied behind his back. The coarse rope dug into his skin, and he struggled to keep up with the pace of his captors. With a bag over his head, he was completely blind, unable to see where he was being taken. The journey was long and arduous, traveling over rocky terrain and crossing rushing rivers. Despite the physical toll, Kofi remained focused, his thoughts solely on his family and his home. He knew he had to find a way to escape and send a message back to his village. And so, he began to leave a trail. Every time the kidnappers took a break or changed direction, Kofi would drag one foot, leaving a small mark in the dirt. He hoped that someone from his village would eventually find the trail and come to his rescue. As the days went by, Kofi's determination grew stronger. He continued to leave small clues, marking rocks and trees along the way. He never gave up hope, despite the fear that had taken root in his heart. Finally, the day came when the bag was taken off of his head. Coffee was momentarily blinded by the light, but as his eyes adjusted, he took in the faces of his captors. He was shocked to see that they were not the feared raiders he had imagined, but white men with guns. It was then that he saw a familiar face. To his surprise and shock, Kofi realized that among the captives was Gan's son, who'd been taken from their village weeks before. Kofi knew then that he had to find a way to escape and bring Gan and the rest of the village to their rescue. The morning sun was shining on Reishi as he awakened to a sober mind for the first time in a while. He looked around and realized the gravity of his actions, the consequences of his constant drinking. He felt a sense of shame and regret wash over him. He stood up and walked to the center of the village, where a meeting was being held. The village elders were discussing a suicide mission. Someone was needed to intentionally get caught and leave a trail for Flomoko and the army to follow and rescue the captives. Rady raised his hand and offered to volunteer. He needed to redeem himself. The elders were shocked but grateful for his bravery and selflessness. Reishi was chosen for the mission. That night, Reishi started walking around the outskirts of the village, drawing the attention of the raiders. He put up a show of a fight, but was eventually overpowered and dragged off into the night. As he was being taken away, he left small clues along the way. A torn piece of his shirt here, a broken twig there, all leading to where he was being taken. The next morning, Flomoko and Seize set off to track Reishi. They followed the trail of clues, each one leading them closer to their friend and comrade. Seize was carrying a powder given to him by Shiba, a village healer. It was a powerful sedative that could put a man to sleep for days. As they tracked, he couldn't help but contemplate using it on Flomoko. Seize was in love with Shiba, and she was carrying his child. But if Flomoko found out about their affair, it would mean the end of everything for them. "We need to find Reishi and bring him back home," Flomoko said, breaking the silence. "Agreed," Seize replied, trying to shake off the internal battle in his mind. They followed the trail for a full day, speaking little and focusing on the task at hand. The tension was palpable between them. Seize was torn between his loyalty to Flomoko and his love for Shiba. "What's going through your mind, Seize?" Flomoko asked, sensing the weight of his companion's thoughts. Seize hesitated before answering. "I'm just thinking about Reishi and the danger he's in. I hope we reach him in time." Flomoko nodded in agreement. "We'll do whatever it takes to bring him back, no matter the cost." As they finally reached the kidnappers' camp, the sight that greeted them was one of chaos and destruction. The sounds of metal clashing against metal and the smell of smoke filled the air. They both knew what they had to do. They were on a mission to rescue their friend and bring him back to safety. The night was dark. The riverbank was illuminated only by the moonlight. Seize and Flomoko, along with their allies, were on high alert, ready for the upcoming battle. The 6 kidnappers approached, weapons at the ready. Seize, Flomoko, and their allies stood their ground, shields up and swords drawn. The battle was intense, with each side fighting with all their might. The kidnappers were well equipped, wielding swords and shields. However, Seize and Flomoko were determined and skilled, their techniques honed from years of training. The two sides clashed. The sound of steel striking steel echoed through the night air. Blow by blow, each combatant engaged in a fierce battle, trying to gain the upper hand. The sounds of battle filled the air as Seize and Flomoko, along with their allies, charged towards the kidnappers, who had been terrorizing the village for far too long. The kidnappers, armed with crude weapons, met the charge head-on, determined to defend their location and keep their captives. The two sides clashed in a brutal, ferocious fight. The kidnappers swung their clubs and axes wildly, while Seize, Flomoko, and their allies deftly parried and counterattacked with their swords and shields. The battle raged on, with neither side giving an inch. Suddenly, The tide of battle shifted as Seize and Flammoko, working in tandem, managed to take down the first kidnapper with a swift strike to the throat. The second kidnapper tried to make a break for it, but was quickly brought down by Flammoko's spear. The third kidnapper, realizing he was outnumbered, fought with all his might, landing several blows on Seize before being overpowered. The fourth kidnapper, a brute of a man, swung his massive club with such force that Seize's shield was nearly shattered. But Seize was not one to be underestimated. With a flurry of strikes, he managed to bring the kidnapper to his knees, ending the battle with a final blow to the head. The fifth kidnapper, a cunning and devious man, tried to make a break for it, but was caught by Seize's trap. As he struggled to break free, Flammoko moved in for the kill, delivering a swift, merciful blow. The final kidnapper, seeing the fate of his companions, threw down his weapons and surrendered, begging for mercy. Flammoko, wary of any trickery, approached the man and demanded to know the location of the kidnapper's camp. In between sobs and pleas for mercy, the kidnapper revealed the location, describing it in detail. Seize, ever the curious one, asked about rumors of white-skinned people he had heard about. The kidnapper, taken aback, began to describe the white man he had seen in the camp. His description was so vivid and detailed that Seize and the others were amazed. The kidnapper went on to describe an ancient firearm he had seen, but quickly admitted that he could not begin to describe how it worked. With all the information obtained, Seize and Flammoko were faced with a moral dilemma. Should they kill the kidnapper or spare him, and possibly risk him leading a rescue party to their location? The two of them engaged in a heated debate, each defending their respective stance with passion and conviction. In the end, the decision was made and the fate of the kidnapper was sealed. Seize and Flammoko stood over the injured kidnapper, his arms and legs bound tight with rope. The man, whose name was Juma, looked up at the two warriors with a pleading expression. "Please spare my life," Juma begged, his voice cracking with emotion. "I am the last of my bloodline. If you kill me, you will bring a curse upon yourselves." Seize sneered at the captive. "You expect us to believe that?" Flammoko stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps there is some truth to his words," he mused. "In our village, we believe that the sins of the father can be visited upon the son. If we kill Juma, could it bring misfortune upon our own families?" Seize shook his head impatiently. "We can't take that chance. This man is a kidnapper and a murderer. He deserves to die." Juma looked from Seize to Flammoko, his eyes pleading. "I admit what I did was wrong," he said, "but it was out of desperation. My village was raided by your people. My family was taken from me, and I had nothing left. I had to do something to survive." Flammoko frowned. Juma nodded vigorously. "Yes, it's true. You killed many of my people, including my parents and my siblings. I am the only one left." Seize rolled his eyes. "We can't just let him go." Flammoko looked at Juma thoughtfully. "What if we spare your life, but banish you from our village? You will never be able to return, but at least you will have a chance to start over." Juma looked at Flammoko gratefully. "Thank you," he said, tears in his eyes. "I will leave this place and never come back. I swear it." As the two warriors untied Juma and set him free, he turned to them one last time. "Remember what I said," he warned. "The blood of my family will curse you if you kill me. But if you spare me, you will have the gratitude of the last of my line." With that, Juma turned and limped away, disappearing into the woods. Seize scowled, but Flammoko looked thoughtful, as if considering Juma's words. Seize swore to himself that if he ever saw Juma again, it would end differently. Flammoko and Seize made their way through the kidnappers' camp, searching for any signs of Fia or Reishi. But the camp was eerily quiet, and they found nothing, as they were about to give up and return to the village empty. Handed, They heard a rustling in the bushes. They drew their swords and moved slowly towards the source of the sound, ready for whatever they might find. But what they found was the same lone kidnapper, wounded and bleeding from a fight. Without hesitation, they tied him up and brought him back to the village, where the elders were waiting for them in the chamber. The room was dimly lit by flickering torches, casting long shadows on the walls. A large table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by chairs where the elders sat. Flamoco and Seze presented the prisoner to the elders, who immediately began to debate his fate. Some argued for enslavement, while others argued for execution. The room was filled with tension as the elders voiced their opinions in the form of parables. The fox that is caught in the trap is desperate for a way out. But we cannot let our own desperation cloud our judgment, said one of the elders, nodding solemnly. Another elder spoke up. The bird that sings too much will attract the attention of the cat. We must be careful not to draw the attention of our enemies. Flamoco and Seze listened intently to the arguments, but they couldn't help but feel frustrated. They needed answers, and they needed them now. Suddenly, one of the elders turned to the prisoner and asked, "What is your name, and why did you come to our village?" The prisoner hesitated for a moment before answering. "My name is Juma, and I am here on a mission of revenge. My village was raided by your people, and I came to take one of your children as a prisoner in exchange for our own." Flamoco and Seze exchanged a look of shock. "Our village raided his," Flamoco said incredulously. The elders murmured among themselves, clearly disturbed by this revelation. One of them spoke up, "If we are no different than our enemies, then what makes us better? We cannot become the thing we seek to destroy." Flamoco and Seze felt their frustration mounting. They needed to find Reishi and Fia, and they needed to do it quickly. But they couldn't deny the wisdom of the elders' words. As the debate continued, the prisoner remained tied up in the corner of the room, a symbol of the difficult decision that lay before them. The future of their village hung in the balance, and they knew that whatever decision they made, it would have far-reaching consequences. Reishi sat beside Fia in the camp of the kidnappers, holding him close and soothing his tears. Fia, Gan's son, had been taken captive along with others by the enemy. Reishi had managed to sneak into the camp to see if he could rescue the boy. As he sat there with Fia, Reishi saw a chance to escape. He looked around for a way out, but then he heard the screams of other captives being tortured. He could not leave them behind. Reishi's heart was torn between saving himself and staying to help the others. Reishi paced back and forth, considering his options. As he did, he saw an opportunity to free another captive who was being guarded by a distracted sentry. Reishi quickly untied the man and gave him directions to the camp of Flamoco. He hoped that the man would make it safely and that Flamoco could rescue them all. Reishi managed to untie the ropes binding him and the other captive, who introduced himself as Siko. Reishi gave him directions and watched as he ran into the night towards freedom. As Reishi turned to leave, he heard a shout from one of the enemy's sentries. Siku had been spotted. Siku ran as fast as he could, dodging and weaving through the trees as arrows whizzed past him. He could hear the enemy soldiers hot on his trail, their angry voices echoing in the darkness. Finally, Siku reached the outskirts of Flamoco's camp, where he collapsed from exhaustion. The soldiers, suspicious of him at first, were ready to kill him until he explained what had happened to Reishi and Fia, and how he had managed to escape. Flamoco and Seze were skeptical of Siku's story at first, but as he spoke more, they realized he was telling the truth. Seze asked, "How is the boy? Is he safe?" Siku looked down, his voice breaking with emotion. "I couldn't get him out. I'm sorry, but I can direct you to the enemy's camp." Flamoco nodded. "We must prepare for war." Seze, "Gather the army together. We march at dawn." As the army gathered and prepared for battle, Siku thought of Reishi and prayed that they would be able to save him and the others. The sound of the drums filled the air, and Saikao marched forward with Flamoko's army, determined to see this mission through. The sun rose high over the village as the sound of warriors donned in war gear could be heard throughout. They left their homes with somber expressions, some of them holding back tears as they embraced their loved ones for possibly the last time. As they gathered, swords clanged against each other. Spears and shields rustled, and archers took their positions, ready to take aim at their foes. The villagers knew that they had a long march to war ahead of them. As they made their way through the forest, the villagers encountered other small groups of warriors who would join them on their journey. They all merged into a large army, the swordsmen and spearmen getting into formation, the archers finding the best spots for defense. A shaman led them in prayer, invoking the spirits of the ancestors to aid them in battle. The two armies eventually met on the battlefield, and the tension was palpable. The villagers stood their ground, determined to protect their land and their families. The archers loosed their arrows, and the warriors rushed forward, swords and spears in hand. The ground shook as they clashed with their enemy, and cries of the wounded and dying could be heard over the clash of steel. Reiti looked at Fia's tear-stained face and knew he couldn't leave him. The other captive had left to seek out help, but Reiti couldn't abandon the young boy. As they sat in the kidnapper's camp, Reishi listened to Fia's stories of his father and their village. Reiti's heart broke as he realized that Fia was all alone now, with no one to protect him. Days passed, and Reisi found himself becoming more attached to the boy. He knew he couldn't stay in the camp forever, but he also couldn't bear the thought of leaving Fia behind. One night, as they sat around the fire, Reishi heard a commotion in the distance. He grabbed Fia's hand and pulled him into the shadows. They watched as the other captive stumbled into the camp, bloodied and bruised. Reichi listened intently as the man recounted his perilous journey to Flamoko's camp. He spoke of close calls and narrow escapes, and Reishi knew that he had made the right choice in staying with Fia. The next day, the kidnappers' camp was attacked by Flamoko's army. Reichi and Fia huddled in their makeshift shelter, listening to the sounds of battle outside. Reishi felt Fia's small hand grip his tightly, and he knew that he had to protect the boy at all costs. Finally, the fighting stopped, and Reishi cautiously peeked outside. Flamoko's army had lost, and Reishi felt a sense of dread wash over him. The enemy was stronger than we expected, Flamoko said. Their warriors were numerous, and their weapons were sharp, but we did not give up. We fought with all our might, determined to bring justice to those who had taken our loved ones. Flamoko's voice was filled with emotion as he recounted out the details of the battle. The villagers listened in awe as he spoke of the bravery of the warriors and the cunning of the enemy. The suspense was palpable as Flamoko spoke of the moments of triumph and defeat, of the wounds and the losses. In the end, we were forced to retreat, Flamoko said. But we did not leave empty-handed. We brought back valuable information that we can use to prepare for the next battle, and we will win the next battle. I promise you that. With those words, Flamoko ended his tale. The villagers were filled with mixed emotions, but they were grateful to have Flamoko back. They knew that they could count on him to lead them to victory in the next battle, and they were eager to hear what his next move would be. Flamoko and Seizei, along with other commanders, gathered the bravest and most skilled warriors for a new mission. They knew the risks, but the fate of their loved ones were at stake. Seizei could feel the weight of the powder in his possession, wondering what it was and what it could do. The group huddled together in the dimly lit hut, carefully studying the enemy camp. They formulated a plan that everyone agreed upon. The mission was to sneak into the enemy camp with Kofi leading the way. As they approached the enemy's territory, they saw sentries patrolling the area. Kofi signaled for them to hide as they waited for the perfect moment. One by one, they quietly crept up behind the sentries and knocked them out, gagging them to prevent any alarms. They made their way deeper into the camp, where they were met with resistance. The enemy was taken aback by the sudden attack and were caught off guard. Flames started to rise in various areas of the camp. causing chaos and confusion. The kidnappers had their families in the camp and were desperate to rescue them. Flomoko and Kofi went off to find Ratia and Fia, while Seze remained alone with the powder and a water skin. His mind raced as he contemplated the contents of the powder. Should he put it in the water skin? What would happen? He remembered the words of Sheba, urging him to be strong in the face of danger. Courage is not the absence of fear, Seze, he heard Sheba's voice say. It's the willingness to act in spite of it. Seze closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and added the powder to the water. He knew not what it would do, but he had faith that it was necessary for their success. Flomoko and Kofi fought their way through the chaos of the enemy camp, determined to find Rachi and Fia. They encountered fierce resistance at every turn, dodging and weaving through the chaotic melee of swords and spears. Their determination and courage were evident in their sharp attacks and swift defenses, taking down enemy warriors with a well-placed strike or parry. As they made their way to the back of the camp, they encountered 3 different situations that tested their skills and bravery. In the first, they fought off a group of warriors trying to surround them, relying on their quick reflexes and impeccable teamwork to outmaneuver and overpower their opponents. In the second, they had to dodge a barrage of arrows from the enemy archers, using the cover of tents and supplies to shield themselves. In the third and final situation, they found themselves outnumbered and backed into a corner. With their backs against the wall, they fought with all their might, their swords flashing in the firelight as they fended off the attackers. Their arms were heavy, their breathing labored, but they refused to back down, knowing that the lives of their loved ones depended on their success. As Flomoko and Kofi made their way deeper into the enemy camp, they finally found Rachi and Fia. Rachi and Fia were exhausted, and Fia had a nasty cut on his arm that had become infected. They quickly realized that the camp was already in chaos, and they took advantage of the confusion to make their escape. They fought their way through the camp, swords and spears clashing as they dodged and weaved through the crowd. The kidnappers were in disarray, and their attention was divided between their prisoners and the invading force. In the heat of the battle, the group faced several different situations, including a close call when a group of armed men nearly caught them. They managed to slip away just in time, leaving the enemy forces behind. As they ran, they could hear the sounds of battle behind them, and they knew they had to move quickly. They were all exhausted, and their breaths were coming in short, ragged gasps. But they kept running until they finally made it to the woods, where they collapsed in a heap. Seze was waiting for them there, and he offered them water from his water skin. Rachi and Fia drank eagerly, and as they did, Seze looked at them with concern. He knew that they had been through a lot, and he wondered what other dangers lay ahead. "Are you both all right?" he asked. Rachi nodded. "We're fine, thanks to Flomoko and Kofi." Seze looked at them with admiration. "You're both heroes," he said. "I did not think we would make it this far." Flomoko and Kofi looked at each other and smiled. They were happy to be of service, but they knew that the real battle was still ahead of them. Seze, who was tormented by the internal struggle of betraying his mentor and leader, Flomoko for the woman he loved, Sheba, finally made a decision. He poured the powder into the drinking water and watched as Flomoko, Rachi, Kofi, and Fia drank from the same cup, both quickly passing out. With a heavy heart, Seze fled the scene. The next morning, Flomoko, Kofi, Rachi, and Fia woke up bound and captive of the kidnappers. As they regained consciousness, they saw the mysterious white-skinned man for the first time. The man was tall, with piercing blue eyes, and a face that was as pale as the moon. He had a commanding presence, and Flomoko and Rachi could sense the danger in the air. Rachi's mind was a jumbled mess, filled with fear and uncertainty. He was a man who had lived a life filled with adventure, but this was the first time he felt truly helpless. He had no idea what was in store for him and what the mysterious white-skinned man had in mind. As the group were marched deeper into the heart of the jungle, They could hear the whispers of the mysterious white-skinned man, who seemed to be speaking in a language that was not of this world. The sound was haunting, and it filled them both with dread. The journey was long, and it was filled with danger at every turn. The end of the trail was unknown, but one thing was for sure. Their lives would never be the same again. Rady, Flamoko, Kofi, and Gaines' son Fia were tightly chained together at the bottom of the slave ship. The four of them lay cramped in a tiny, dark, and damp space, with no room to move or stretch. The stench of sweat and feces was overwhelming, and the relentless rocking of the boat made it difficult to maintain balance or keep their stomachs from turning. Despite their dire circumstances, Raichi tried to find solace in comfort and distraction. He whispered soothing stories to Fia about his father and the efforts made to rescue them. He spoke of Gan's bravery and determination, reminding the young boy of his father's love and care for him. "Do you know, Fia, your father told me many stories of his adventures. And Jayla, a wise man from our village, told me many more stories from his trips to the east," Raichi said with a hint of a smile on his face. "One of my favorites was the story of 1001 Arabian Nights and a Night." As Raichi began to spin the tale, he was interrupted by the sound of the guards coming down to distribute the meager rations of food and water. The captives were barely fed enough to survive, and the process was grueling and inhumane. But even as they were being mistreated, Raichi continued to whisper the story to Fia, using the tale as a means of escape from their reality. In between telling stories and surviving the harsh conditions of the ship, Raichi and the others were also subjected to washings. The guards would roughly haul them up to the deck and use salt water to scrub them clean, regardless of the wounds and bruises inflicted upon their bodies. Despite the constant interruptions and the never-ending hardships, Raichi persevered in his mission to keep Fia's spirits up and give him hope. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, the stories became a source of comfort and escape for all four captives. They clung to the hope of one day being rescued and reunited with their loved ones. And Raichi's tales provided a glimmer of that hope in their dark and hopeless world. As the slave ship docked on the shores of the island, Raichi, Flamoko, Kofi, and Fia were filled with a mix of fear and excitement as they stepped off the ship and onto the sandy beaches. The language that surrounded them was a cacophony of unfamiliar sounds, and their eyes were wide with wonder as they took in the sight of different skin tones and faces. They had never seen anything like this before, and their minds were trying to comprehend the enormity of what was happening. As they walked through the crowded streets, they found themselves at an auction where men and women were being sold off like property. The auction was bustling with activity, and the sound of money exchanging hands echoed in the air. The four of them were separated from one another and put up for bidding. Flamoko was the first to go, with a group of men bidding furiously for him. He felt his heart racing as the bidding went higher and higher, fearing that he would be separated from his friends. But just as it seemed that he was about to be sold to the highest bidder, an unexpected twist of fate saved him. A wealthy merchant walked in, seeking strong men to work in his fields. He saw the strength in the three friends and child, and, in a stroke of good luck, he bought all four of them as a group. They all breathed a sigh of relief as they were reunited, grateful for the small mercy that kept them together. The auction was a blur of activity, with bidding and bargaining happening all around them. The men and women who were sold were treated as nothing more than cattle, with no regard for their well-being or dignity. Despite the fear and discomfort they felt, Raichi, Flamoko, Kofi, and Fia remained steadfast, determined to make the best of their situation and find a way back home. Seize returned to his village and informed the elders that Flamoko was dead. The news spread fast, and people were seen rushing towards Seize's hut. Among them was Jayla, an elder in the village. As soon as Jayla saw Seize, he confronted him about the sudden death of Flamoko. Why was Flamoko's death so sudden? Did you have anything to do with it? Jayla asked, his voice full of suspicion. Seze remained calm, trying to explain that Flamoco's death was a result of his injuries sustained during the battle. However, Jayla refused to believe him and accused him of poisoning Flamoco. Seze tried to defend himself, but it was no use. Jayla remained adamant and threatened to have him executed. Suddenly, Sheba, who was heavily pregnant, stepped in between them, pleading with Jayla to calm down. Jayla hesitated for a moment, looking at Sheba's protruding belly. He finally gave in and backed off. Seze took the opportunity to declare himself the new leader of the village, reminding everyone of his bravery in leading the army to victory. He instructed the carpenters to construct a huge chair for him to sit in, as a symbol of his new position. Seze declared that the war was over, and it was time to make peace with the other warring villages. Jayla stepped up to the podium and faced the people of the village. The air was thick with grief and anger at the loss of Flamoco. The elders and villagers alike had gathered to hear what he had to say. "My dear people, we are all gathered here today to mourn the loss of Flamoco. He was a great leader, a noble warrior, and a kind-hearted man, who always had the best interest of the village at heart. But his life was cut short by betrayal." Jayla's voice carried across the crowd, and many of the villagers began to weep at the mention of their beloved leader's name. "Betrayal is like a snake in the grass," Jayla continued. "It strikes when you least expect it, and it poisons everything it touches. Our village has been struck by this snake, and it has left us wounded and broken." Seze and Sheba stood at the back of the crowd, their faces darkening with displeasure as Jayla continued to speak. "But revenge is not the answer," Jayla said. "Revenge is like a fire that burns out of control. It consumes everything in its path, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. If we seek revenge, we will only continue to perpetuate the cycle of violence." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Jayla's words seemed to have a calming effect on them. "We must find a way to heal our wounds and move forward," Jayla said. "But I fear for the direction our village is headed. We have lost a great leader, and there are those among us who seek to take advantage of this situation for their own gain." Seze and Sheba exchanged worried glances, sensing the warning in Jayla's words. As Jayla finished speaking, the villagers began to weep and wail, mourning the loss of their leader. But Seze and Sheba stood in the back, their eyes fixed on Jayla with a newfound suspicion. The air was heavy with a sense of impending doom, and they both knew that the village would never be the same again. Beyond the distant mountains, there is a small remote hut in the African wilderness. Inside the hut, an old man sat by a crackling fire, humming a haunting melody. He was known as the Zoo, a title given to him as the village's most powerful medicine man. As the Zooey reached into a jar and threw some powder onto the fire, the flames suddenly grew brighter and changed colors. In the new light, a messenger appeared, dressed in the finest leather. "The chief requests your presence in the morning," the messenger said, bowing low. The Zooey didn't say anything at first, but as the messenger turned to leave, he cleared his throat. "Take your time heading back," he advised. "Seze doesn't know how long it took you to find me. Linger, and you'll avoid his foul mood. I should see him before you do. Linger if you know what's good for you." The messenger nodded, understanding the Zoo's warning. He knew better than to cross the powerful medicine man. "As they say, the one who takes advice is the wise one," he said, reciting a popular saying. "But the one who takes his time is the smart one." With that, the messenger left, taking his time as he made his way back through the dark trail. He knew the path well and didn't need to see to navigate it. The messenger, a man named Goso, was a tall man with broad shoulders and a lean build. His dark skin was etched with scars, telling a story of battles and close calls with death. His eyes were a piercing shade of brown, and his hair was cut close to his scalp. He walked with a confident gait, each step measured and precise. Despite his rugged exterior, there was a sadness that seemed to linger just beneath the surface. As a child, the messenger had grown up in a small village, much like the one he had just left. His parents had been farmers, and they had worked tirelessly to provide for their family. But one day, a group of raiders had attacked the village, burning homes and killing anyone who stood in their way. The messenger had watched as his parents were murdered before his eyes, and he had been forced to flee into the wilderness alone. For years, the messenger had lived as a nomad, moving from place to place in search of a new home. He had fought in countless battles, earning a reputation as a skilled warrior and earning the respect of many. But despite his successes, he could never shake the sadness that haunted him. Now, as he walked through the dark trail, he could feel the weight of his past bearing down on him. He moved slowly and confidently, avoiding rocks and other obstacles with ease. As he walked by the empty courtyard, he couldn't help but notice the giant chair. The chair was a magnificent sight to behold. It was carved out of the finest wood, its intricate design showing the skill and craftsmanship of the village's best carpenters. It was tall and imposing, with a high backrest that curved into 2 armrests. The seat was wide and comfortable, covered in soft animal skins and lined with plush cushions. Ivory inlays decorated the arms and legs of the chair, contrasting with the dark wood. Copper adornments were worked into the design, glinting in the light of the torches. The back of the chair was covered in shimmering snakeskin, the pattern of the scales drawing the eye. Iron bolts secured the joints, making the chair strong and sturdy. It was the grandest chair in the village, fit for a leader, and as the messenger looked upon it, he knew that the new leader would be a force to be reckoned with. The messenger, Goso, couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness as he looked at the chair. It was a symbol of power and wealth, something that he had never had in his life. But he refused to let his past define him. He straightened his shoulders and continued on his way. Finally, he arrived at his own hut and settled in for the night. From a bird's-eye view, the village could be seen in all its complexity, with tall brick walls, mango trees, and a river winding behind it all. The messenger knew that the coming day would bring great change to the village, and he couldn't help but wonder what the Zooey's visit to the chief would bring. Zoe, the medicine man, was an old man who appeared to be in his 70s. He was tall, standing at around 6 feet, with a thin frame that was still surprisingly sturdy. His skin was dark, like rich mahogany, and etched with lines that spoke of a long and eventful life. His hair was gray and worn in a tight braid that hung down to his waist, adorned with feathers and beads. Despite his advanced age, Zoe moved with an almost youthful grace, his body flowing from one position to the next as he went about his work. His eyes, the color of honey, were deep and soulful, with a hint of mischief that belied his age. He wore a simple robe made of rough-woven cloth, cinched at the waist with a leather cord, which was embroidered with intricate patterns and symbols of his trade. Zoe was a man of great mystery, and no one knew much about his past. He had come to the village many years ago and had quickly made a name for himself as a skilled healer and wise man. But no one knew where he had come from before that, or what had led him to this place. Some whispered that he had been a great warrior in his youth, while others claimed that he had been a wandering nomad, traveling across the vast African plains in search of enlightenment. Despite his enigmatic past, Zoe was revered and respected by all who knew him. His knowledge of the natural world and its healing properties was unparalleled, and he was known to perform miracles with his potions and remedies. But there was also an air of danger around him, as if he held secrets that could change the course of history itself. Some said that Zoe was a man of the spirits, that he communed with the gods themselves to gain his knowledge and power. Others claimed that he was a shaman, a master of the ancient African arts of magic and sorcery. Whatever the truth of his past, one thing was certain: Zoe was a force to be reckoned with, a man of great power and mystery who held the fate of the village in his hands. The sunrise in the village was a sight to behold, with the orange hue of the sun casting a warm glow over everything in its path. The grand hut at the center of the village was surrounded by guards, their spears tipped with sharp metal that glistened in the new sunlight. Seize emerged from the hut, his physical appearance a testament to his past betrayal of the former commander. He was now the new chief and commander of the army that Flomoko had put together. Seize was escorted by his guards to the giant chair, where Zoe was sitting on a mat. The crowd had gathered around to watch the proceedings, with Abby and his wife standing among them. Jayla, the Akwai, the wisest man in the village, was also present, as was the messenger Goso. Abby and his wife stood among the crowd that had gathered to witness Seize's ascension to chief and commander of the army. Abby was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a rugged appearance. He had a thick beard, and his long hair was tied back with a leather cord. His wife, on the other hand, was petite with delicate features. She wore a colorful dress made of woven fabric that flowed around her ankles as she stood. Despite their differences in appearance, they both had a look of quiet determination on their faces as they watched the proceedings. As Seize climbed up onto the giant chair, his face showed a slight hint of fear as he looked down at Zoe. Abby, who was standing in the crowd watching, couldn't help but notice Seize's expression. He whispered to his wife, "Look at Seize's face." Jayla leaned forward, his wrinkled face serious as he muttered a parable under his breath. "You can hide the flame, but you can hide the flame, but you cannot hide its heat." His words hung heavy in the air, the crowd falling silent as they contemplated the meaning behind his words. Seize glanced at Jayla, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention back to Goso. Zoe cleared her throat and addressed the crowd. "There is a saying in our village that goes, 'You can't hide your true intentions,' just as the moon can't hide its light behind the clouds. It means that no matter how hard you try to conceal your motives, they will eventually be revealed. So it's better to be honest and upfront about your intentions rather than hiding behind deception." Seize cleared his throat and fixed his gaze on Zoe. "There's a parable I once heard," he said, his voice low and measured. "It tells of a wizard who possessed great power, able to command the elements and bend them to his will. He could summon fire, create storms, and even bring the dead back to life. But despite his abilities, he was weak in body and could not defend himself when it mattered most." Seize paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. In the end, the wizard was betrayed by those he thought were his allies, and his magic was useless against the swords and spears of his enemies. He learned too late that true strength comes not from magic, but from the power of one's own body and will. He finished speaking and glanced at Zoe again, his expression unreadable. As Seize looked at Goso, the messenger began to speak. The suspense hung in the air as everyone listened intently, wondering what would happen next. Goso, the messenger, cleared his throat and spoke up, breaking the tense silence. "Chief Zoe, honored guests, I have been summoned to bear witness to a quarrel regarding the refugees and prisoners of war that our village has taken in. As we all know, they have become a strain on our coffers, and the burden of feeding and sheltering them is becoming too much to bear." Abby and his wife exchanged worried glances, clearly feeling the weight of the situation. Goso continued, "An emissary from a neighboring village has offered to take them away, exiling them from our lands. This would relieve us of the strain of caring for them and free up resources for our own people. Additionally, they have offered to trade us weapons in exchange for the prisoners." Jayla stroked his beard thoughtfully, considering the proposal. Seize looked intrigued, nodding his head in agreement with the idea. Zoe's expression was unreadable, and the crowd murmured nervously among themselves. Abby stepped forward, his voice shaking slightly. "But what of our honor?" Goso replied, "The emissary assured me that they would be taken care of, and no harm would come to them, and we would have no blood on our hands." Seize leaned forward, his eyes alight with excitement. "And think of the weapons we could acquire. Our village would be stronger, and our enemies would tremble at the sight of us." Jayla held up a hand, silencing the murmurs in the crowd. We must consider all options and not make a hasty decision. This is a weighty matter, and we must weigh the pros and cons carefully. As the group deliberated, Abby's thoughts drifted to the prisoners. He knew that many of them were innocent villagers caught up in the chaos of war, and he couldn't bear the thought of abandoning them. But the strain on their resources was becoming too much, and he didn't know how much longer they could hold out. Suddenly, Abby's thoughts were interrupted by a loud noise. He looked up to see Cézanne holding an ancient gun, one that he had never seen before. It was a stick that summoned lightning, and the sight of it filled him with both awe and fear. Cézanne grinned triumphantly. With weapons like these, we could conquer any enemy. We must seize this opportunity. The group continued to debate, the suspense thick in the air. The fate of the refugees and prisoners of war hung in the balance. Zoe listened intently as the messenger spoke, his face scrunched up in a frown. When Goso finished speaking, Zoe spoke up. "I disagree with this trade," he said firmly. "We don't know what fate has in store for these refugees and prisoners if we were to send them away with strangers. It's not our way to abandon our own like this." Zoe then spoke a parable. A bird in a cage may not know what the future holds, but it knows that it is safer in its cage than outside in the unknown. We cannot in good conscience trade our own people like goods without knowing their fate. The crowd murmured in agreement, and even Cézanne looked somewhat uneasy at the proposal. Cézanne leaned forward, his expression turning dark. "That is not your concern, Zoe," he said. "You are here to provide an impartial opinion, nothing more." Zoe bristled at the dismissive tone in Cézanne's voice. "I am well aware of my role here," he said sharply, "but I will not be silenced when I see injustice." Cézanne laughed mockingly. "Injustice," he said. "You, who have spent so long wandering the wilderness, have no concept of justice. Your opinions are worthless." Zoe clenched his jaw, his eyes flashing with anger. "My opinions may be worthless to you, Cézanne," he said through gritted teeth, "but I will not stand by and watch as the village is led down a path of destruction." Abby stepped forward from the crowd, his face tense with emotion. "I remember the last time we tried to flee this village," he said, his voice quivering with anger. "Cézanne and Flamoco thought we were kidnapped and sent a raiding party after us to another village. They burned it to the ground, killed innocent people. It was a mistake, a horrible mistake that created the very refugee we are now discussing trading away like cattle." Cézanne scowled at Abby. "And who are you to lecture me, Abby?" he said. "You, who have never held a weapon or shed blood in battle. You know nothing of the sacrifices I have made for this village." Abby flinched as if struck. "I know that you set out to rescue me and my family," he said softly, "and I know many of these refugees are from villages Commander Flamoco raided on our behalf." Cézanne shook his head, his expression hardening. "I will listen to no one who seeks to undermine my authority," he said. "The decision is mine alone, and I have made it. We will trade these refugees and prisoners for weapons, and any who oppose me will be dealt with accordingly." Cézanne looked down at his feet, his expression troubled. "Abby, I understand your pain," he said softly, "but we must do what is best for our village. We cannot continue to drain our resources on prisoners and refugees. We need weapons to protect ourselves from our enemies." Zoe shook his head, his eyes flashing with anger. "We do not know what fate has in store for these people," he said, his voice firm. "We cannot simply trade them away like goods. We must find a better solution." He then turned to the crowd and spoke a parable about how even the smallest stone thrown into a pond can create far-reaching ripples, and that we never truly know the extent of our actions. The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding their heads in understanding. The emissary from the other village stood stoically, waiting for their decision. The village was at a crossroads, and they knew they had to make a decision that would impact their future. The crowd murmured nervously, sensing the tension in the air. Jayla stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Seze. "My friend," he said, his voice laced with sorrow, "you are treading a dangerous path. You must be careful not to let your strength become your downfall." Seze sneered at Jayla. "And what would you know of strength, old man?" he said. "Your wisdom is nothing but empty words." Jayla bowed his head, as if in defeat. "You are right, of course," he said quietly. With that, Jayla turned and walked away, his form disappearing into the crowd. Seze watched him go, a flicker of doubt crossing his features. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, as if wrestling with some inner conflict. But then he shook his head, as if to clear it, and looked down at Zoe with renewed resolve. "Enough of this," he said. "The matter is settled. Let us move on." And with that, Seze descended from the chair and strode away, his guards falling into step behind him. Erastus was a striking figure with his colorful clothing and exotic appearance. He wore a loose-fitting tunic of vibrant hues and pants that seemed to be made from some unknown material. His boots were intricately embroidered, and his hat was adorned with a feather that looked like it came from some exotic bird. As Erastus stood before the council, he exuded an air of confidence and experience. He had traveled the world and had many tales to tell. He had even accompanied Jayla on his journey to the east, where they had encountered many dangers and faced impossible odds. Erastus spoke the language of the pale-skinned men fluently, having learned it during his travels. He had come to the village to offer his services as a trader and diplomat, and had quickly made an impression on the council. His proposal to take the refugees and prisoners off their hands had initially caused some dissent, but his charm and persuasiveness soon won them over. Erastus regaled them with stories of his adventures and the exotic lands he had visited. He spoke of a place where people rode giant birds through the sky, and of another where the trees glowed in the dark. He even showed them an ancient gun, which he called a stick that summons lightning, and explained how it worked. Despite Zoe's objections, Erastus's proposal was ultimately accepted by the council. As he departed from the village, he promised to return with more goods and wonders to trade. And with his vast experience and knowledge, it seemed likely that Erastus would continue to play a significant role in the affairs of the village. Jayla's simple hut sat in the midst of the lush green forest, the morning sun peering through the gaps between the leaves. Jayla himself sat cross-legged in his small abode, his eyes closed, deep in meditation. Suddenly, the snap of a twig disturbed the tranquil atmosphere, and Jayla's eyes opened slowly. He emerged from his humble dwelling to find Erastus, his old friend, holding a broken stick in his hand. Erastus snapped it again, the sound echoing through the trees. Jayla smiled and welcomed him in, gesturing to the wooden stool in the corner of his hut. As Erastus looked around, he couldn't help but think how different his life had been compared to his old friends. He'd traveled the world, had seen things that most could only imagine. But Jayla had found peace and contentment in this small forest village. The two old friends reminisced about their youth, when they had journeyed to the east together, and had countless adventures. They spoke of the magical things they had witnessed, the people they had met, and the knowledge they had gained. Erastus was curious about Jayla's people, wondering why they seemed so ignorant of the larger world. Jayla's response was one of caution, explaining how he once tried to share his knowledge, and his friend went mad with the information, turning to drink. "I once told my friend Reishi some secrets about my travels to the east," Jayla said, his voice low and measured. But when he heard the secrets, he went crazy. Never was the same again. Erastus's eyes flicked up from his cup, his expression tense. "What kind of secrets?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jayla leaned back, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as he thought back to that day. "The kind of secrets that could change everything," he said. "The kind of secrets that could make a man go mad." Erastus swallowed hard, His eyes locked onto Jayla's. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I did what I had to do," Jayla said, his voice firm. "I took care of my friend, and I kept the secrets hidden." Erastus let out a shaky breath, his eyes darting around the room. "You're sure no one else knows?" he asked. Jayla's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "I'm sure," he said. "But why do you ask?" Erastus shifted in his seat, his eyes avoiding Jayla's gaze. "Just—" Jayla studied him for a moment longer before leaning back in his seat. "You know, Erastus," he said, his voice calm, "there are some things that are better left unsaid. Some things that can't be unsaid once they're spoken." Erastus nodded slowly, his expression grave. Jayla nodded, satisfied, and the two men sat in silence for a few moments longer before Erastus stood to leave. "Why didn't you tell the elders about the white man?" Erastus asked. Jayla sighed. "I'm not good at delivering bad news." Erastus stood up to leave. "You know what's going to happen next, don't you?" Jayla replied softly, "Yes, I do." Erastus probed, "And you're okay with it?" Jayla's voice was steady, the stick that gives you the power of God. Technology and progress can't be slowed. Perhaps it's better for Seize to have that power and victimize others rather than someone doing it to us. Better to be the criminal than the victim. Erastus nodded and turned to leave. "I hope you're right, my friend. I hope you're right." Jayla returned from his travels to find his friend Reishi eagerly waiting for him. Reishi was always fascinated by Jayla's stories and adventures. He wanted to hear every detail. Jayla knew that there were certain things he couldn't reveal to anyone, even his closest friend, but he decided to share what he could. As they sat down together, Reishi begged Jayla to tell him everything he saw and experienced. Jayla hesitated, knowing that there were secrets that he couldn't share. "There are things I can't tell you, Reishi," Jayla said, "but there are some things I can share. But you must be careful." Jayla began to describe his journey to the pyramids and everything that made it special. He explained how the pyramids fit into the universe and how they were connected to everything around them. Then he talked about the symbols and pictures he saw on the walls inside the pyramid. Jayla revealed that if you breathed a certain fume, you would be able to understand the symbols. Reishi was fascinated and eager to learn more. Jayla warned him that what he was about to reveal was dangerous, but Reishi persisted. Jayla explained how he breathed the fumes and left his body, floating off the planet. He described the Earth from high above and the realization he had that nothing was real. He described how he saw the beginning and the end of the planet and how it was all just a story. Reishi was confused and didn't understand what Jayla meant. "I don't understand." He said, "How can it all be a story?" Jayla pulled out a small sack and took some of its contents and mixed it with his tobacco. He burned it, and Reishi breathed in the fumes. Suddenly, everything made sense to him. He realized that he was a part of a story, and also the storyteller. It was a revelation that drove him mad. He developed a stutter and could only speak straight when he told stories. No one took him seriously, and he began drinking heavily. Jayla regretted telling Reishi everything. He had become cautious with his knowledge, resigned to be just an observer of life's events, and enjoyed the story as best he could. He knew that some things were better left unsaid, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Seize's hut was a sight to behold, with its pristine condition and intricate decorations adorning every corner. Trophies from battles won and weapons from vanquished foes hung on the walls, giving the hut an air of strength and power. Sheba, Seize's wife, was just as beautiful as the hut itself, holding their newborn baby girl as she breastfed her. The baby girl in Sheba's arms is a precious beauty. She is small and delicate, with soft, chubby cheeks and tiny fingers that wrap around her mother's thumb. Her skin is a warm caramel brown, just like her mother's. and her hair is a fluffy cloud of black curls. Her eyes are closed in contentment as she suckles at Sheba's breast, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. She is a picture of innocence and vulnerability, completely dependent on her parents for love and care. As Sheba looks down at her daughter, a wave of love washes over her, and she knows that she would do anything to protect this precious life. Seize turned his attention back to Sheba, who was still breastfeeding their baby girl. He watched as the little one suckled contentedly, completely oblivious to the world around her. Seize's gaze wandered to a water skin hanging from the wall. He couldn't help but think about the last time he shared water with others. 3 men and a boy, all of them thirsty and desperate for water. As Seize's eyes lingered on the baby, a servant entered the hut carrying a hot bowl of yam stew, the savory aroma wafting towards Seize's nose. Sheba poured him a cup of water to accompany the meal, but Seize didn't touch it. Sheba's eyes followed Seize's every move as he ate the yam and stew in front of him. However, she noticed that he hadn't touched the cup of water she had poured for him. She felt a pang of disappointment and worry in her heart. Was he not satisfied with the meal? Did he suspect something was wrong with the water? Seize noticed Sheba's concerned look and smiled at her reassuringly. "Don't worry, my love. The meal is delicious, but I'm just not thirsty at the moment." Sheba breathed a sigh of relief, but the worry still lingered in her mind. She knew that Seize had been distant and suspicious lately, and it pained her to think that he might not trust her. Sheba's daily routine revolved around her baby girl and the household servants. She would wake up early in the morning, just as the sun started to rise, and breastfeed her baby before handing her off to the nanny. She then proceeded to her personal chambers to get ready for the day. Sheba would put on a light layer of makeup and adorn herself with her favorite jewelry, making sure to always look her best. One day, as Sheba was getting ready, she noticed that one of the servants had accidentally broken a valuable vase that was handed down to her from her mother. Instead of lashing out in anger, Sheba calmly asked the servant how it happened and then reassured her that everything was okay. She even went so far as to offer to help the servant pay for the damages, even though it was not necessary. Seize had been watching the entire time, and although he was proud of how Sheba handled the situation, he couldn't help but feel a sense of distrust. Another day, while Sheba was walking through the courtyard with her baby, she noticed that one of the younger servants was struggling to carry a heavy basket of laundry. Without hesitation, Sheba offered to help the girl, even though it meant delaying her own schedule. She carried the basket all the way to the laundry room and even helped the girl wash the clothes. Seize observed all this from afar and couldn't help but wonder if Sheba was using her kindness to manipulate the servants. On a third occasion, Sheba noticed that one of the household guards was feeling under the weather. Instead of simply brushing it off, Sheba went to the kitchen and made him a warm cup of tea, which she delivered to him personally. Seize watched from a distance, feeling impressed by his wife's thoughtfulness, but at the same time questioning her motives. Despite Sheba's daily acts of kindness, Seize's distrust of her continued to grow. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something from him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. As a result, he became more distant from her and spent less time at home, leaving Sheba feeling isolated and alone. Sheba and Goso first met when Seize had to go on a hunting trip for a week, leaving Sheba alone with her newborn baby and the household servants. Sheba was feeling lonely and overwhelmed, and Goso noticed her distress. "Is everything all right, Sheba?" Goso asked, approaching her in the courtyard. Sheba wiped a tear from her eye and looked up at him. Goso nodded sympathetically. "I understand. It's not easy taking care of a newborn on your own." They continued to chat and found that they had much in common. They were both interested in cooking, and Goso shared some recipes with Sheba. They also enjoyed storytelling, and Goso told her some amusing anecdotes about his childhood. As the days went by, they continued to spend time together. Sheba would often visit Goso's quarters to chat or help him with his chores. They would sit in the shade of the trees and gossip about the other servants or discuss their dreams for the future. Eventually, they became inseparable. When Seize returned from his hunting trip, he was surprised to find Sheba and Goso chatting and laughing together like old friends. "You two are friends?" Seize asked, eyeing Goso suspiciously. Sheba quickly stepped in to ease his fears. "Yes, Seize. He's just a friend." Seize looked skeptical, but didn't say anything more. He could see that Sheba and Goso had formed a strong bond, and he didn't want to come between them. Over time, Sheba and Goso's friendship only grew stronger. They would often spend long afternoons together, lost in conversation or working on a project together. Seize couldn't deny the joy that Sheba's friendship with Goso brought to her life, and he was grateful for the bond they had formed. Sheba remembered the day Seize made Goso his messenger. Seize sat in his hut, his brow furrowed with concern as he pored over a map of the surrounding area. He knew that he needed a reliable messenger to help him keep track of the various factions and tribes that he was responsible for overseeing. He glanced up as Goso, one of his most trusted advisors, walked into the hut. "Greetings, Goso," Seize said, looking up from the map. "I've been thinking about our need for a reliable messenger, and I've decided that you're the man for the job." Goso looked surprised but pleased. "Thank you." "Seize." "I do," Seize replied. "You're smart, reliable, and you know this area better than anyone. I think you'd make an excellent messenger." Goso nodded. "I won't let you down, Seize. What do you need me to do?" "First, I need you to start organizing the messages that come into our village," Seize said. "I want you to sort them by sender and by importance. Then, I want you to start delivering messages to the other villages and tribes in the area. You'll be my official messenger. Go." "So." Goso smiled. "I'm ready for the challenge, Seize. I'll get started right away." As Goso left the hut, Sheba felt a sense of relief wash over her. She knew that Goso would more freely be able to come and go. Rumors began to spread among the household servants about Sheba and Goso. Some whispered that they had seen the two of them talking for too long. Others claimed that they had seen Goso helping Sheba with tasks that were not his responsibility. The gossip started to spread like wildfire, with each retelling more scandalous than the last. Some of the servants were genuinely concerned, fearing that Seize would punish Sheba if he found out about the rumors. Others, however, seemed to be enjoying the drama and eagerly spread the gossip to anyone who would listen. As the rumors continued to circulate, tensions in the household began to rise. The servants whispered behind closed doors, casting furtive glances at Sheba and Goso whenever they were in the same room. Even Seize, who had once been a beloved and respected leader, seemed to be growing distant and irritable. The mood in the household had shifted, and no one seemed to know how to fix it. As the days passed, a strange aura settled over the household of Seize. The once vibrant and lively atmosphere was now cloaked in a thick blanket of unease and discomfort, like an impending storm on the horizon. The servants who were once quick to exchange smiles and greetings with Seize and his family now averted their gaze and spoke in hushed whispers. Their footsteps were hesitant and their movements cautious, as if they were walking on eggshells. Seize himself was not oblivious to the change in the air. He could sense the palpable tension, but he couldn't quite put his finger on the cause. Like the calm before a storm, there was a sense of foreboding that hung heavily over the household. It was as if the weather itself had changed, and the once bright and sunny days had been replaced with overcast skies and a cold, biting wind. The air was thick with an unspoken fear, and it was a fear that seemed to have taken root in the very bones of the household. No longer were the days filled with laughter and chatter, but instead, they were marked by a heavy silence that only served to amplify the tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. It was a mood that had settled over the household, and it was one that refused to dissipate, much like the storm clouds that loomed on the horizon, threatening to unleash their fury at any moment. In the past, when the servants saw Sazay, they would nod respectfully and say, "There goes Sazay, a good man and strong leader." But now, the mood in the household had shifted, and their whispers behind closed doors had grown louder. When Sazay walked by, they would look at him with judgmental eyes and mutter under their breath, "There goes Sazay, whose wife has male friends." The tone was accusatory and full of innuendo, as if they knew something he didn't. Sazay could feel the difference in the way the servants treated him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what had changed. He just knew that something wasn't right. The day of the refugee and prisoner transport was chaotic and tense. The refugees were huddled together, carrying whatever belongings they could salvage from their destroyed homes, while the prisoners were marked with white chalk, indicating their status as captives. As the line of prisoners tied together with leather straps began to form, some of the refugees accidentally got chalk on them as they tried to navigate through the crowded area. As the transport began, the refugees were forced to walk alongside the prisoners, as there was no other path for them to take. It was a grim reminder of the fragility of their lives, as they were all now at the mercy of the mercenary group called the Hantai. The group was notorious for their ability to tie people up in various ways, and they were now using this skill to traffic humans. Enam, the leader of the Hantai mercenary group, was a towering figure with broad shoulders and rippling muscles. His skin was tanned and weather-beaten, a testament to the years spent traveling across the harsh wilderness. His hair was dark and unkempt, falling in wild tangles around his chiseled face. Enam's eyes were dark and piercing, like two shards of obsidian. He had a rugged, angular jawline and a thin, cruel mouth that seemed to be permanently set in a sneer. His voice was deep and commanding, carrying a weight and authority that demanded respect from those around him. He wore a suit of battered black armor, adorned with strange symbols and etchings that seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering torchlight. A battered sword hung at his side, the blade pitted and nicked from countless battles. Enam moved with the easy confidence of a predator, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings for any sign of danger. He radiated a palpable sense of menace, like a coiled serpent waiting to strike. Lofa, a refugee, approached Enam. Enam turned to face Lofa, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "You are being taken to a new life," he said with a dark tone. "A life of servitude where you will work for your betters and do as you're told. You're lucky we're even taking you in, considering you're nothing but a burden to society." Lofa trembled at Enam's words. "Please." "Sir, we didn't mean to cause any trouble," he pleaded. "We just want a chance to start over." Enam sneered. "Your chance to start over ended when you chose to flee your homes," he said. "Now you'll pay the price for your cowardice." As Enam turned to walk away, Erastus saw something in his eyes that chilled him to the bone. It was a darkness, a cruelty that went beyond mere indifference. Erastus knew then that they were in the hands of monsters, and there was no telling what fate awaited them. The Hantai mercenaries were notorious for their ability to tie people up in various ways. Their skills came in handy during escorts, as they could use a leather cord to tie from hand to hand, ensuring that nobody would get lost in the dark or escape. However, their use of this technique extended beyond mere escort duties. They now used it to transport and traffic humans, treating them like mere objects to be moved and sold at their discretion. Their cold, calculating demeanor left little room for compassion or empathy. They viewed the refugees and prisoners alike as nothing more than commodities to be bought and sold, and the Hantai was just another tool in their arsenal to maximize profits. As the refugees and prisoners were tied together with leather straps, the Hantai mercenaries looked on with a cruel satisfaction. They relished the power they held over these people and reveled in the fear they instilled in their captives. The prisoners had no hope of escape. They were being exiled and had nowhere to go, with death in the wilderness or being kidnapped by one of the ravaging groups as their only fates. The mercenaries made sure to remind them of this fact, threatening them with violence and death should they try to escape or disobey. The refugees walking alongside the prisoners knew they had no choice but to comply with the Hantai's demands. They had lost everything and now had to rely on the mercy of these heartless mercenaries to ensure their survival. It was a bleak and depressing scene, with the Hantai mercenaries donning their uniform of black leather and metal, a menacing presence that promised pain and suffering for anyone who crossed them. They were a force to be reckoned with, and few dared to challenge their authority. As Erastus spoke with Enam, the leader of the Hantai mercenaries, he couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. Enam was a towering figure, his cold, dead eyes looking through Erastus with a cruel intensity. "So, you want safe passage for your refugees?" Enam sneered, his voice laced with malice. "What makes you think I should give a damn about your pitiful little group?" Erastus stood his ground, meeting Enam's gaze with a determined stare. "I'm willing to pay whatever it takes for safe passage," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Enam chuckled, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Money? Oh, we'll take your money, all right. But that's not all we want. We want your obedience. We want your fear. We want your fear. We want your fear. We want you to know that we hold your fate in our hands." Erastus swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Enam's words bearing down on him. He knew he was dealing with a ruthless group, and he had to tread carefully if he wanted to ensure the safety of his people. The Hantai mercenaries may have been skilled in the art of tying people up, but their true power lay in their ability to instill fear and submission in anyone who crossed their path. And as they continued their journey, the refugees and prisoners alike knew that they were at the mercy of these heartless monsters. Seze stood at a distance, observing Erastus and Enam's conversation. Their expressions grew darker as they noticed Seze's presence. Seze called for Goso and handed him a rolled-up cloth with strange symbols on it. "This is a sealed message," Seze warned. "You are not to open it under any circumstance. You are to go with Erastus and deliver it to its destination." Goso nodded, but before he could ask any questions, Seze continued. "You will be supplied along the way. Pack for an indefinite amount of time." "How long will I be gone?" Goso asked. Seze replied with parable. "Once upon a time, there was a young boy who wanted to climb a tall mountain. He set out on his journey, but after a while, he realized he was lost. He came across an old man who offered to guide him to the top of the mountain. The young boy agreed, and they set off together. As they climbed, the old man would occasionally stop and point out different landmarks and tell stories about them. The young boy was fascinated and felt grateful to have such a knowledgeable guide. After some time, the young boy noticed that the old man had led them in a circle, and they were back where they had started. The young boy was confused and angry, feeling as though the old man had wasted his time and led him astray. The old man simply smiled and said, "My dear boy, trust is like a compass. You must use it to guide you. But even the most reliable compass can be off at times. Sometimes, the journey is just as important as the destination, and it is our destiny to learn and grow along the way." The young boy thought about the old man's words and realized that although he did not reach the top of the mountain, he had gained valuable knowledge and experience from his journey. From that day forward, he trusted in his own instincts and the guidance of those he trusted, knowing that even if he did not reach his intended destination, he would still learn and grow along the way. Goso thought for a moment and then replied with his own parable. Once upon a time, there was a servant who served a respected elder in a small village. The elder was known for his wisdom and kindness, and the servant trusted him deeply. One day, the elder asked the servant to deliver a message to a neighboring village. The servant agreed without hesitation, believing that the elder had his best interests at heart. However, as the servant traveled down the path towards the neighboring village, He began to encounter unexpected obstacles and dangers. The journey was long and arduous, and the servant grew increasingly wary. Despite his exhaustion, the servant pressed on, fueled by his trust in the elder. But when he finally arrived at the neighboring village, he discovered that the message he had been carrying was not what he had been led to believe. In fact, the message was a deceitful ploy, designed to harm the people of the neighboring village and benefit the elder's own interests. The servant was shocked and dismayed, realizing that his blind trust in the elder had led him down the wrong path. From that day on, the servant learned to be more discerning and cautious, realizing that not everyone who appears to be trustworthy has pure intentions. He learned to question authority and to make his own judgments based on his own observations and experiences, and he never forgot the lesson he had learned from the elder's betrayal. Seize smiled. Trust is like a thread. Once it's broken, it can't be reconnected. With that, Arastas, Enam, and Goso set off, followed by a long line of refugees and prisoners. Goso watched as the Han Tai mercenaries tied up the prisoners, leaving them with no chance of escape. Sheba watched from a distance, tears streaming down her face. She knew that Goso might never return, and the loss of her friend weighed heavily on her heart. As the long trail of humans marched off in the distance, a crowd gathered to watch them go. Sheba watched them go. Sheba watched, lost in thought, and lost track of time. Suddenly, she realized that her breasts were full of milk and went to feed her baby. But when she reached for her child, she realized that the baby was missing. Panic set in, and everyone started searching for the baby. Seize was frantically searching through his belongings, his hands shaking as he threw things aside in a wild search. Beads of sweat dripped down his face, and his eyes darted back and forth with fear and worry. He called out for Goso, his voice strained and trembling. But there was no answer. Seize stumbled towards his hut and almost fell to his knees as he realized that his baby was missing. Panic set in, and he felt a sense of dread wash over him. His baby, his only child, was gone. He was in a state of shock and despair and couldn't think straight. Seize was in a panic and continued to summon Goso, but he realized that Goso was long gone. He began to suspect that Goso kidnapped his baby. Seize ran to Jayla for assistance, and Jayla investigated the situation. Seize frantically paced back and forth, his mind racing with fear and suspicion. He had summoned Goso to help find his missing baby, but now he couldn't shake off the thought that Goso might be responsible for the kidnapping. Where could she have gone? Who could have taken her? Seize muttered to himself, his eyes darting around in search of any clue. Jayla approached Seize, his expression grave. Abby and his wife are missing too, he said. It's possible they're involved in the kidnapping. Seize's face turned pale with shock. What? But why would they do that? They've always been loyal to us. Jayla shook her head. I don't know, but we have to find them and the baby. Time is running out. Seize's mind was racing with a million thoughts. He couldn't believe that the people he trusted the most could betray him like this. He gritted his teeth in frustration and fear and vowed to get to the bottom of this. We have to move quickly, Sheba said, her voice trembling with anger and despair. We have to find them before it's too late. Seize paces back and forth in his hut, his mind racing with fear and desperation. He knows that his duty as a leader is to stay with his people and protect them, but his heart aches with the thought of his baby daughter in danger. He stops and looks at Jayla, his eyes wild with terror. What do I do? He asks her, his voice hoarse. I can't just leave my people behind, but I can't stay here knowing that my baby is out there somewhere, alone and scared. Jayla puts a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him. I understand your pain, Seize, she says, her voice soothing. But we have to act fast if we want to find your daughter. I think we should go after her together. Seize nods slowly, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. But what about the village? He asks. Who will lead them? Jayla looks at him sternly. "You taught us well," says A. "We can handle things here. You need to focus on finding your daughter." Seze's heart was heavy as he weighed his options. As the leader of the village, he had a responsibility to his people. But his only child was missing, and every moment that passed felt like an eternity. He paced back and forth, his mind racing with thoughts of his daughter's safety. "I can't leave the village," he said to Jayla. "There are too many people counting on me. I have to stay and keep them safe." Sheba ran through the night, her feet pounding against the hard earth. The caravan was almost a day's run ahead of her, but she refused to give up. She could see the trail they left behind, faint impressions of feet and carts in the dirt. Finally, she caught up to the very tail end of the caravan, where the stragglers were still making their way forward. She collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. As she rested, she could see the long line of people ahead of her, moving slowly but steadily forward. She knew that somewhere in the midst of that mass of humanity was her missing baby. She forced herself to her feet, determined to catch up. For hours she ran, chasing the tail of the caravan like a mirage on the horizon. She could see it in the distance, always moving forward, always just out of reach. Finally, as the sun began to set, she caught up to the slow-moving column of people. The caravan stretched on for miles, a giant centipede of carts and people winding its way across the landscape. Sheba pushed her way through the throng of refugees, searching for any sign of her baby. But the chaos of the caravan made it difficult to find anyone, much less a single missing child. Still, she pressed on, running until she was breathless and stumbling. She fell into a fitful sleep, alone and vulnerable on the edge of the caravan, determined to keep going until she found her child. As Sheba ran after the caravan, she spotted a baby being carried by a woman up ahead. She quickened her pace, heart racing, convinced it was her own child. But as she got closer, she could see that the baby was a boy and not hers. The woman carrying the child looked at her with confusion as she ran past. Later that day, as Sheba caught up to another group of refugees, she saw a small figure bundled up in a cloth. She felt a surge of hope as she ran towards them, but as she approached, she realized it was just a doll. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the inanimate object, feeling the weight of her loss. As the night grew darker, Sheba's eyes began to play tricks on her. She thought she saw her baby being carried by different people in the distance, but as she got closer, she could see that it wasn't her child. Exhaustion and desperation began to take their toll on her, and she began to lose hope that she would ever find her baby. As Sheba traveled with the refugee caravan, she grew increasingly desperate to find her missing baby. She began asking around, hoping someone had seen her child. One day, she approached an elderly man who was also searching for a lost family member. "Excuse me, sir," Sheba said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'm looking for my baby. Have you seen a little girl with curly hair and bright eyes?" The man shook his head. "I haven't. I'm sorry, but I'm searching for my son. He went missing a few days ago." "I'm sorry to hear that," Sheba replied, sympathy evident in her voice. "I hope you find him soon." As Sheba continued her search, she met more and more people who were looking for lost loved ones. She spoke to a woman who was searching for her husband and a young boy who had been separated from his parents. "Have you seen my little boy?" the boy asked, tears streaming down his face. Sheba's heart broke for the boy and his family. She knew all too well the pain of losing a child. "I haven't seen him, but I'll keep an eye out," she promised. As she continued to travel with the caravan, Sheba began to notice more and more mothers who had become refugees in their search for lost family members. They shared their stories with each other, providing comfort and support in their shared grief. One evening, Sheba sat by the campfire with a group of these women. They shared memories of their loved ones and talked about the hope that kept them going. "I pray every night that I'll find my baby," Sheba said, tears streaming down her face. I can't give up hope." "We won't let you," one of the other mothers replied, placing a comforting hand on Sheba's shoulder. "We'll search for her with you." Sheba was exhausted from her journey, but her determination to find her baby kept her moving. She moved from camp to camp, asking everyone she met if they had seen her child. It was during one of these conversations that she met a woman who told her about the prisoner caravan and the families who followed it. "The prisoner caravan rarely stops," the woman explained, "but there are families who keep up with them. These are the family members of those who are prisoners. They have no choice but to follow their loved ones to their fate." Sheba was heartbroken to hear this, but it only fueled her determination to keep moving forward. She knew she had to get to the front of the caravan where the prisoners were being held. She pushed herself to keep going, not stopping to rest until she finally reached the back of the prisoner chain. That's when she saw him, a prisoner named Juma. She approached him, her voice shaking with emotion. "Have you seen my baby?" she asked desperately. Juma took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice thick with emotion. "I was born in a small village, nestled in the mountains. It was a peaceful place, full of life and laughter. My parents were farmers and my siblings and I helped them tend the fields. Life was hard, but we were happy." He paused for a moment, his eyes clouding with tears. But then, one day, everything changed. "Your people came and attacked our village, burning our homes and killing our loved ones. I watched as my parents were slaughtered before my very eyes, and my siblings were taken away, never to be seen again." Sheba gasped, horrified by Juma's story. "I'm so sorry," she said, her own eyes welling up with tears. Juma continued, his voice shaking with emotion. "I was the only one left, and I had nowhere to go. I wandered the mountains, barely surviving. But then I heard of a group of men who were fighting against your people, seeking justice for those who had been wronged. I joined them, hoping to find a way to avenge my family and my village." Sheba listened intently, her heart breaking for Juma's loss. "And did you find what you were looking for?" she asked softly. Juma shook his head, his eyes filled with sorrow. "No, I didn't. We were caught, and I was the only one who survived. I was captured and brought here, to your village." Sheba looked at Juma with compassion. "I'm sorry that my people did this to you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Juma looked at her, his eyes full of pain. "I know you didn't do this to me, Sheba, but your people did. And now I am alone in the world with nothing left to live for." Juma had just finished recounting his tragic tale to Sheba when Abby and his wife suddenly appeared out of nowhere. They had been listening in on Juma's story, and the shock of what they had heard was written all over their faces. As Juma turned to face them, Abby and his wife fell to their knees and wept uncontrollably. Juma looked at them with confusion and concern, unsure of what was happening. Finally, Abby managed to compose himself enough to speak. "Juma, we need to tell you something," he said. His voice choked with emotion. "It was our fault that your village got raided. We were afraid of the kidnappers, so we fled. We were afraid of the kidnappers, so we fled. We thought we could escape them, but we were wrong." Juma stared at Abby in disbelief. "How could you have caused the destruction of my home?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Abby and his wife nodded, their tears still streaming down their faces. "We're so sorry," Abby said. "We never should have left. We should have stayed." As Abby was about to respond to Sheba's question, a loud horn interrupted them. They all looked up to see a massive ship docked at the port. Juma, who had never seen anything like it before, was shocked and stared in awe. The ship was made of dark wood and had intricate carvings all over it. It was massive, with several masts towering high into the sky. The crew on board the ship was a flurry of activity, moving quickly and purposefully as they went about their tasks. Humans of all shapes and sizes walked up the ramp onto the boat, carrying various goods and supplies. Sheba's attention was drawn to a figure on board the ship in a colorful outfit. As she looked closer, she recognized Erastus, the merchant she had met years ago. Next to him was Goso, holding a bundle in his arms. Sheba's heart leapt, thinking that it might be her missing child. Without a second thought, she took off running towards the ship, screaming. Before Sheba could reach the ramp, Enam appeared out of nowhere, knocking her down and surprising her. "This one got loose. Tie her up," he shouted to the other crew members. Sheba struggled as they bound her hands, but it was no use. As the Hantai quickly tied Sheba's hands and attached her to another prisoner, Sheba could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Panic began to set in as she realized the gravity of the situation. She was being taken away from everything she knew and loved, and she didn't know where she was going or what was going to happen to her. She tried to struggle and break free, but it was no use. Erastus and Goso arrived just in time to see Sheba being marched onto the boat. They could hear her protests and screams, and they knew they had to do something. "What's going on?" Erastus demanded, his voice laced with anger. "Why are you taking this woman?" "She's a prisoner," the Hantai mercenary replied coldly, "and she's not your concern." Goso stepped forward, pleading with the Hantai to let Sheba go. "Please, you don't understand. She's Seize's wife. She shouldn't be here." The Hantai leader sneered. "If this is how Seize's wife looks, why should that matter to me?" Sheba looked disheveled and exhausted after days of traveling without proper rest or hygiene. Her hair was matted and tangled, and her skin was coated in a thin layer of dirt and sweat. It was hard to believe that she was Seize's wife, given how bad she looked. Because Seize is a powerful man. If you take his wife, you'll have the entire Seize clan after you, Erastus warned. But the Hantai leader just laughed. "I'm not afraid of some backwater clan. Now get out of my way before I make you regret it." In the chaos, one of the Hantai struck Sheba, silencing her protests. Erastus and Goso exchanged a worried look, knowing they couldn't stop the Hantai from taking Sheba. As the boat pulled away from the dock, Enam arrived on the scene, trying to sort out the disagreement. But it was too late. The ship had sailed off, and Sheba was on it. As Sheba was struggling against her leather binds, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching her. She turned her head to see Enam, flanked by a group of heavily armed mercenaries, making his way towards her. Enam surveyed the scene and quickly ordered the mercenaries to release Sheba from her binds. The Hantai leader protested, but Enam silenced him with a stern look. "Release her, now." Enam's voice was cold and commanding. The mercenaries quickly complied, cutting the leather binds that held Sheba in place. She rubbed her wrists, which were sore from the tight bindings, and stood up shakily. Enam turned to Sheba. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice softening. Sheba shook her head, still in shock at the sudden turn of events. "No, I'm okay." Enam nodded and gestured for her to follow him. Sheba followed Enam and his men, still dazed from the whole ordeal. As she walked, she could feel the eyes of the mercenaries on her, studying her closely. She was aware of how she looked. Her hair was tangled and matted. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and she hadn't had a proper wash in days. She could understand why they might find it hard to believe she was Seize's wife. But as she walked with Enam and his men, she knew that she was safe for the moment. She clung to the hope that she would find her baby soon and be reunited with her husband. One of those things would be true. Sheba, Erastus, Enam, and Goso found themselves in the cramped quarters of the ship captain's chamber. The small room was dimly lit by a single lantern, and the walls were adorned with maps and charts. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and unwashed bodies. Sheba, looking exhausted and disheveled, spoke up. Erastus shook his head. "I'm sorry. Sheba, "We don't have your baby, but we are headed to an island, and we'll drop you off there in a few months." Goso's eyes widened in surprise. A few months? That's a long time to be gone. The attention then turned to the bundle Goso was carrying. Sheba asked if she could see it. "Of course," Goso said, as he carefully unwrapped the cloth that protected the scroll inside. Inside, they found not a baby, but a message scroll with intricate markings and calligraphy. Sheba's eyes darted around the room. "Can I tour the ship?" she asked, hoping to catch a glimpse of her baby. Inam snapped his fingers and a Hantai mercenary walked into the room. "This is Eudaimon," he said. "He'll take you anywhere you want to go." Sheba's heart sank. Even though she wasn't wearing leather binds, she still felt like a prisoner. Eudaimon was a towering man with sharp, angular features. His hair was pulled back in a tight knot, and his eyes were a piercing shade of green. Sheba examined him closely, then turned to Inam. "Can't you come with me?" Inam shook his head. "I have business to attend to. Eudaimon will keep you safe." Sheba felt a knot form in her stomach as Eudaimon gestured for her to follow him out of the chamber. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched and that her every move was being monitored. Eudaimon took Sheba on a tour of the giant ship, beginning with the top deck where they stood overlooking the sea. "This is where the crew and refugees gather when the weather is nice," he said, gesturing to a group of people chatting nearby. "This is where the captain gives orders." Sheba looked around anxiously, still hoping to spot her missing baby. Eudaimon took her to each part of the ship, describing its history and where it had traveled. "This ship was built in the coastal city of Nihon," he said, "and has traveled to many ports." As Eudaimon led Sheba towards the refugee area, she saw rows and rows of makeshift tents, constructed with sticks, canvas, and whatever scraps of fabric they could find. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, unwashed bodies, and despair. Sheba saw men, women, and children huddled together, their faces sunken and their eyes empty. They had given up hope of a better life, and their ragged clothes and gaunt faces testified to the constant hunger and exhaustion that plagued them. One young girl, barely 5 years old, ran up to Sheba and tugged at her sleeve. "Are you going to take us to a better place?" she asked with a hopeful smile. Sheba felt a pang of sadness in her heart as she looked at the little girl. "I'm sorry, little one," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm just here to see what's happening on the ship." As Eudaimon led her further into the refugee area, Sheba saw a group of men sitting in a circle, playing a game with stones. A few women were huddled together, cooking some meager scraps of food over a small fire. She could see the longing in their eyes as they looked at the ship with a mixture of hope and despair. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air, followed by the sound of someone sobbing uncontrollably. Sheba's heart raced as she turned to see a young woman holding a small child in her arms, shaking with grief. "What's happening?" Sheba asked, her voice shaking with fear. "She just found out her husband died," Eudaimon replied, his voice grim. "He was sick for weeks, and no one could do anything to help him." Sheba felt a lump in her throat as she saw the woman's tears, her heart breaking for her loss. She looked around at the refugee area, feeling a deep sense of sadness and helplessness. "These people deserve a better life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Eudaimon replied, his voice filled with regret, "but we can only do what we can to help them. Come on, let's move on." The Hantai area was a sharp contrast to the refugee area. It was much smaller and confined, with a low ceiling and dim lighting. The air was thick, with the smell of sweat and the sound of grunting men. Eudaimon led Sheba down a narrow corridor, passing by several small rooms on either side. She could see the shadowy figures of men huddled together inside, some sleeping, some playing games. As they walked, Eudaimon explained that the Hantai were a nomadic people who roamed the desert in the west. They were skilled fighters and often worked as mercenaries, offering their services to the highest bidder. They were also known for their harsh discipline and adherence to tradition. Sheba noticed that the men in the Hantai area all wore similar clothing, with loose-fitting pants and long-sleeved tunics made of a rough, dark fabric. Their hair was short and unkempt, and many had tattoos on their arms and chests. She felt a sense of unease as they passed through the area. The men stared at her as she walked by, some leering and making suggestive comments. Eudaimon glared at them and muttered something in their language, causing them to quiet down. Finally, they reached the end of the corridor, where a heavy wooden door stood closed. Eudaimon pulled out a key and unlocked it, then pushed the door open. Inside was a small room with a low bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window covered by a thick curtain. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern hanging from the ceiling. "This is where you'll be sleeping," Eudaimon said, gesturing to the bed. "It's not much, but it's better than the refugee area." Sheba nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. She had hoped to be able to stay with the refugees, to be able to help them in some way. But she knew that she was at the mercy of the Hantai, and that she would have to make the best of her situation. As they approached the storage area, the guard stepped forward, blocking their path with his massive frame. "No one is allowed in here," he growled, his voice low and menacing. The guard stood tall, towering over Eudaimon with broad shoulders and bulging biceps. His thick neck and chiseled jawline gave him a menacing appearance. His eyes were small and dark, with a cold and unwavering gaze that seemed to pierce through the soul. He wore a black suit of armor with intricate gold engravings that glistened in the dim light. Eudaimon, on the other hand, was of average height and build. He had a lean and agile frame with a scar running diagonally across his left cheek. His eyes were bright and lively, with a spark of mischief that belied his serious demeanor. He wore a simple leather tunic with a short sword hanging from his waist. The guard's eyes narrowed, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword. "I don't care who gave you permission," he spat. "No one gets in here without my say. So." The tension in the air was thick, and it seemed as though a fight was about to break out. Sheba's heart raced as she watched the two men square off, each ready to defend their position with deadly force. But then, Sheba stepped forward, holding her hands up in a gesture of peace. "Please," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's no need for violence. We'll go back to our quarters." Eudaimon hesitated for a moment, his hand still on his sword. But then, with a resigned sigh, he lowered his weapon and stepped back. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But I'll be back." The guard watched them go, his eyes following them until they disappeared around the corner. He then turned back to the storage area, his hand still on his sword. He knew that there were secrets hidden inside, secrets that he was sworn to protect at all costs, and he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. Days turned into weeks as Sheba spent her time with Goso, sharing stories of her past. She spoke of being chosen to be the bride that would unite two rival villages. She spoke of her childhood, of the customs and rituals of her village, and of the tragic loss of her baby. She tried to imagine what her little one might be doing at that very moment, but the uncertainty always left her heart heavy. Goso listened to Sheba with empathy and comforted her as best he could. Meanwhile, Erastus spent much of his time gambling with the Hantai. He amused himself by playing tricks on them and occasionally performing a bit of magic to keep them on their toes. They found him to be quite the character and couldn't help but laugh at his antics. Deep in the slave quarters, Juma wept loudly to himself. He missed his family dearly and wished more than anything to be free from his bonds. The days were long and hard, and the thought of never seeing his loved ones again filled him with a deep sense of sorrow. Despite the ongoing distractions, Sheba found herself unable to resist the temptation of sneaking up to the storage area. The guard stationed in front of the door was ever vigilant, and his constant humming made it difficult for her to concentrate. She couldn't help but feel a sense of desperation rising within her as she strained to hear any sounds coming from within. She tried to get closer, but the guard noticed her and started singing loudly. The sound of a baby crying caught Sheba's attention, but it was drowned out by the singing of the guard, the weeping of Juma, and the laughter of Erastos as he continued to win at gambling. As the ship drew closer to the island, Sheba could see it in the distance, looming over the horizon. It was a rugged, volcanic island with steep cliffs that fell sharply into the sea. The island seemed to be buzzing with activity as boats flitted back and forth between the port and larger ships anchored offshore. As they neared the port, the hustle and bustle became more intense. She could see dozens of ships of all sizes and countless people running back and forth, carrying crates and goods. The sounds of clanging metal and shouting filled the air. It was a chaotic scene, and Sheba felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as the ship docked. The refugees were just as excited, and as they were allowed to disembark, they rushed off the ship eagerly. They had been cooped up for weeks, and the promise of a new life on this strange island was all they could think about. Meanwhile, Enam was briefing Erastos and Goso in the captain's quarters. "Listen carefully," Enam said. "Everyone except the prisoners will have to pay for passage, including all the refugees. The reason the prisoners won't have to pay is because they are being sold. The buyers will pay for their transport." Goso looked confused. "What about the refugees who can't pay?" he asked. "They would be sold to the highest bidder and would have to work off their debt," Enam explained. Many of the Han-Tai were working off debts. Many of the refugees might become Han-Tai if they proved their worth. Goso was shocked. So the refugees would be treated just like the prisoners. Sold off. Erastos interjected. "Goso, your job is to deliver a message to a wealthy merchant on the island and return home. That's it." As Enam spoke, the prisoners were being led off the ship to a holding area. The holding area was a large, open-air enclosure, surrounded by a tall wooden fence. Inside were dozens of prisoners, all chained together in groups. They sat huddled together, looking up as the refugees were led past them to a certain area not unlike the prisoner area. The refugees were met by a group of people of many races who looked them over carefully. Han-Tai mercenaries then began separating the refugees into a new group of males and females. When they were done, it was impossible to tell refugee from prisoner. The two new groups formed were just as desperate and hopeless as the other. Meanwhile, Sheba had wandered down to the storage area below deck. As she looked around, she became distracted by a noise and turned away for a moment. When she looked back, the guard was missing and the storage area was empty. She ran up to the deck to find the guard, scanning the bustling port for any sign of him. As she looked around, she saw a familiar-looking person in a Han-Tai uniform, separating men from women. She stared at him in disbelief as he examined the men one by one. Suddenly, the world spun around her, and she fainted. Juma found himself in the male area of the dock, where a bucket was placed in front of him and the others. They were told to wash themselves, which they did hesitantly, feeling the rough texture of the rag in their hands as they scrubbed their bodies. As he looked around, he saw familiar faces from his old life, now reduced to chains and rags. They formed two lines, one for males and one for females, and then began inspecting each person. The Han-Tai mercenaries were rough with the people, pulling them by their arms and pushing them to the front of the line. They examined each person's body, checking for any signs of injury or disease. Some of the refugees and prisoners were frightened by this process and tried to resist, but the Han-Tai were unforgiving. As they completed their inspections, the Han-Tai mercenaries began to move people around. They took some of the prisoners and mixed them in with the refugees, and vice versa. This made it difficult to tell who was who. The refugees and prisoners were confused by this process. They had been traveling together on the ship, but now they were being separated into new groups. Some of the refugees were afraid that they would be sold off, just like the prisoners. They had heard stories of the harsh treatment that prisoners received on the island, and they did not want to be a part of that. As they were being separated, many of the refugees pleaded to stay together, but their requests were met with blank stares. When they were done, it was impossible to tell who was a refugee and who was a prisoner. Juma found himself in the male area of the dock, with a bucket placed in front of him and told to wash himself. He looked around as he bathed, taking in the other men around him, as he was handed a rag to dry off with. He recognized the person handing it to him. "We meet again," Juma said. "Commander Flamoko."